Hello everyone, welcome to What If Hollow Knight Took Over Little Nightmares movie. Before we start, please go support Alanmash for writing that awesome fanfic. This is the translated version I made, there will be some mistaken characters' gender. Phase 1. Signals of Infection. This phase of the book takes place after 6 drops mono, but something happens and the Pale City and Hellenist combine into one. The Radiance finds the signal tower and uses it to amplify its infection to the bugs of Hellenist and the viewers of the Pale City, bringing dead humans from the Little Nightmares world back to life, much stronger than before. Mono wakes up in Deepnest and meets up with the Knight. The two decide to work together to defeat the Radiance and bring down the signal tower for good. But in this new world, will the two of them be able to survive and save everyone from the Radiant signal tower? Only fate can decide. PH1. CH1 Deepnest. Mono opened his eyes and looked around. The last thing he remembered was running from the flesh entity, leaping for 6 and then 6 dropping him into the signal tower. But why did she do it? Maybe her hand slipped, maybe she had a reason to, maybe she wasn't the same 6 as before. He thought. Mono shook the thoughts out of his head. I'll find out why she dropped me soon enough, right now, I need to find her. He thought. Mono looked around the area he was in and it appeared to be some sort of cavern. There was a TV behind him, a few ruined pieces of structure, what looked like a broken tram, and these weird-looking creatures on the floor. Upon closer inspection, Mono realized they were dead. He didn't know what they were, but he didn't want to end up like them. Mono then realized he had a few things with him. He had his flashlight and a large soup ladle. Might come in handy. He thought, looking at the objects. He looked around for a while longer and then he found his paper bag. He thought that it was lost in the Pale City, but for some reason, it was right next to the TV. Mono picked up his paper bag and pulled it over his head. It felt satisfying to stare through the eye holes of his bag once again. Mono turned on his flashlight and started to look for a way out of this underground cavern. He found a small tunnel that led towards more tunnels, moving all around him. He was suddenly put on edge when he heard several disturbing noises. It sounded like enormous bugs were moving all around him, watching him, getting ready to strike. Mono held onto his flashlight, constantly on edge, looking around for something that might attack him. Suddenly, 3 large bugs came out of the ground and they leapt at Mono, with their mouths barred. Mono ducked away from the bugs and pulled out his ladle. It was surprisingly really heavy to hold in his hands, but it didn't matter, he needed to defend himself. One of the bugs leapt at him and he struck them to the ground, crushing them with his ladle. The bug got back to its feet and the others jumped towards him. Mono ducked under them and once they landed, he slammed his ladle on them with all his might, crushing them. Mono took deep breaths, looking at the squashed bugs, their guts oozing out. He did not like this. Not one bit. He needed to get out of here and find 6. Unless 6 was trapped in here, of course. The thought of possibly leaving 6 in these horrible caverns frightened him and he decided to venture further into these tunnels and try and look for her. He couldn't leave without looking for her, it just wasn't like him. Mono hung the ladle around his jacket and ventured further into the caverns, holding his light close. He looked around for any sign of friendly life that could possibly help him. He didn't like being alone. He didn't like having no friends. He needed to find 6 or someone, anyone that could help him find a way out of these tunnels. Suddenly, a giant bug crawling through the earth emerged into the tunnel Mono was in. Consumed by fear, Mono ran for his life. The bug crawled through the tunnel, inching closer and closer. Suddenly, Mono saw a hole in the ground. Without thinking twice, he leapt into the hole and fell down into another tunnel. At least I'm away from that bug. He thought to himself. He flicked on his flashlight and saw something that could possibly help. A TV. There was nothing else except for the hole that he entered through, but no way was he going back up there with that giant bug. He walked towards the TV and realized that it was active. He placed his hands on the television screen and warped through another TV. He looked around and saw that he next to a pile of dead bugs. He instantly backed away and looked around. He was in a room with nothing but an open door. He walked outside and found himself in a large open cave. He looked at the room he just left and it seemed to be made out of webs. He looked down and saw that there was a long drop underneath him. He looked up and saw another structure made of webs, this one having a light. Maybe there are some friendly people in there. He thought as he climbed the ledges toward the structure. He entered the room and found even more bugs. But these bugs weren't like the other ones. They were wearing cloaks, standing tall, and one of them looked like they were selling things to the others. "Excuse me? Can you help me?" he asked one of the bugs. "Of course. Please, sit down and rest," the bug said, pointing to a bench. "Yes. You must be tired. Sit and rest," another bug said. "We are friends. Please sit," another bug said. Mono found this all highly suspicious, but he was very tried, so he sat down. Once he did however, he was stuck, with webs covering him. He tried to get off the bench, but he was stuck in place. Suddenly, the bugs gathered around him and knocked him unconscious. When he woke up, he was bound with several webs and inside yet another cavern. He struggled to break the webs and broke free. He fell to the ground and his flashlight and ladle fell on top of him. "Talk about a rough welcome," he said as he got to his feet. He picked up his ladle, turned on his flashlight and started to wander around. He stepped on the webbed, sticky surface of this cavern and looked around for a way out. Suddenly, he looked and saw a giant spider-like bug, wearing a mask. Mono inched closer and the creature yelled, opened its mask and started violently swinging at him. Mono ran away as fast as he could, into another room. He looked and saw that the beast was not pursuing him. Instead, it crawled back into the darkness and closed its eyes. That's a relief. Mono thought. He looked around the room and saw that there were bugs, bound with several webs just like he was. He looked closer and found that their insides were hollowed out, most likely eaten. Suddenly, one of the bugs moved. Mono looked and saw a small bug, about his size, with a dark blue cloak and a white shell with horns. It's alive. Mono thought. What if it's friendly? I can't just leave it here. Mono pulled out his ladle and started to hit the webs on the ground that seemed to be holding it in place. He hacked at the webs and once they were destroyed, the bug fell to the ground, the webs around it falling off. Mono inched towards the bug, unsure if he could trust it, checking to see if it was still alive. "Hey," he whispered. "Are you okay?" Suddenly, the bug started to get up. It pushed itself up with its arms and looked up at Mono with a hollow gaze. Mono crouched down offering his hand to the bug. It continued to stare at him and then took his hand. Mono helped the bug to its feet and the two just stared at each other, exchanging hollow gazes. Ch1Ch2. The empty vessel. The knight took the hand of the mysterious boy and got to their feet. They looked up and stared into the boy's eyes for a few seconds. They had a paper bag over their head, similar to cloth, but this time it was a bag. And they had a long brown coat over them, with two eye holes looking at it with a very similar hollow gaze. The boy reminded it of itself in a way. It didn't have much of a purpose, it hid its face, and they just seemed hollow in general. Just like them. "Hello," the boy said. "My name is Mono, what's yours?" they asked. The knight didn't know how to answer. It had no voice to do so. Not only that, it couldn't think of a way to respond because it had no mind to think. Luckily it didn't need to do so, because two loud "Rhea" came from behind Mono. The knight looked and saw two little weavers making their way towards both of them, walking on their silk. Mono ran to the back of the room to try and hide, but the knight leapt forward, drawing its nail, and delivered two swift blows to the first little weaver, orange bubbles of infection bursting out of them, then pogoed on top of the other one until it fell to the ground. The knight landed, then made its way to their companion, who was staring in shock. "Wow, didn't know you knew how to fight so well," Mono said. The knight put its nail behind its back and gave a shrug to Mono. "Anyway, you never told me your name," Mono said. The knight just stared at him. "Can you not speak?" The knight shook its head. "Oh, so that's why you weren't telling me," Mono realized. "Well, I need to ask, you wouldn't happen to know where we are, would you?" The knight walked over and held out its map for Mono to see. Mono studied the map for a while, then spoke. "Hellenist?" he asked. "Is that the name of this place?" "Hellenist." The knight nodded. "And where are we?" The knight pointed to a section of the map titled Deepnest. "Deepnest, huh? Do you happen to know a way out of here?" Mono asked. The knight nodded again, then started to walk out of the room, moving its arm, motioning Mono to follow. Mono jogged up to the knight and the two walked out of the room. The knight noticed it was dark and decided to take out its lumifly lantern, but for some reason, it was gone. And not just that, all of its charms were gone too. Suddenly, a light came from behind it. It looked and saw Mono holding some sort of torch, which was showing light in a certain direction. "It was getting a little dark, so I figured I'd turn this on," he said. The knight nodded and then motioned for Mono to follow it. The knight walked through the tunnels and came face to face with a stalking devout. Mono backed away, shivering. The knight looked at its companion to see what was wrong. "I am not going near that thing," they said. The knight shrugged. It understood. Besides, it was just a stalking devout. To most travelers, they can be deadly enemies, but to those who are trained and well equipped, they are just a simple punching bag. The knight walked towards its enemy, with its nail at the ready. The devout noticed its approaching enemy and opened its mask to yell out. The knight struck the devout while its mask was open, then dashed away to avoid the creature's swings. The devout backed away, and once its mask was open again, the knight unleashed a shade soul right towards the creature's face, obliterating it. The knight made their way over to Mono and motioned them to follow. At first they were hesitant, but once they saw that the devout was defeated, they nodded and followed the knight. The two of them made their way through the beast's den, defeating the little weavers and stalking devout's along their way. Occasionally, the knight would look back at its companion to make sure they were okay. Deepnest was not a place for a boy like them, and the knight wanted to make sure they stayed alive. It wasn't the first time they had lost a companion. Memories of Cloth came back to the knight. She was so eager to prove herself, so determined to become strong, so brave in the face of danger. Yet she was brought to an end by the Trader Lord. The knight felt sorrow in her demise, but not that much because of some closure from her spirit. She was happy up there, and the knight wished her the best of hope to find Nola. The memories faded, and the knight snapped back into reality as it guided Mono through the beast's den. They came to a turn, and the knight remembered why it had come here in the first place. It was to make sure of something. It climbed up ledge and came to a room where there was a sleeping figure atop a stone bed. The figure was none other than Hera, the beast. Hera was one of the three dreamers, and in their sleep, they created a seal which contained the hollow knight inside the black egg. The seal was made to contain the infection, but the infection managed to escape containment and was now in the kingdom of Hellenist. Now, the knight had to break the seal in order to get to the hollow knight and take its place. Without further hesitation, the knight struck Hera with its dream nail and was teleported into the dream realm. There, floating atop the stone floor, was Hera herself. The knight struck Hera with their nails several times until she was weakened enough for the knight to absorb. It began to focus its energy, and the essence of Hera was sucked into the knight's hollow shell. Meanwhile, at the temple of the black egg, a mask disappeared and a radiant scream rang out from inside. PH1CH3. Wandering through the caverns. Mono struggled to climb up the ledge to keep up with his new companion. He didn't fully trust them, but they seemed to know their way around the place, so he had to trust them. He came to a room where there was a light shining over a sleeping figure on a stone bed, and at the foot of the bed was the little bug. "Hey," he said. "Are you okay?" Mono inched closer to the bug and saw several dreamcatcher particles surrounding both the sleeping figure and their companion. Mono inspected their companion and found that they were asleep. "Hey. Wake up," he whispered to them. His words failed to wake them up and they just laid there sleeping. Suddenly, the large figure faded into dreamcatcher particles and their companion woke up. It looked at Mono and gave a motion to follow. Mono nodded and the two dropped down a small hole. They came to another area and then Mono followed the bug through another hole. He found himself in the same room where he entered with a bunch of scattered robes and masks that belonged to the bugs that had tricked him into sitting on the bench. He felt a tap on his shoulder and looked to see their companion motioning them to follow. This guy needs to learn how to speak. Mono thought as he followed the bug. The two of them walked out of the room and began to jump onto the other ledges towards what looked like a broken elevator. The bug leapt onto it, but before Mono could do so, they slipped and began to fall. "Aye," Mono yelled. Suddenly, he landed in a pool of thick black water. He paddled his way to shore and called for the bug. "Hey. Help," he yelled. "Down here." But no one came down. Maybe they didn't notice me as I fell. Maybe they can't hear me. Surely they wouldn't abandon me, would they? Mono thought to himself. He waited for a while, then decided to find a way back up to the village. He walked along the floor of a tunnel, but suddenly, when he took another step, the floor crumbled, revealing sharp spikes. Mono quickly leapt backwards, narrowly avoiding his death. "I'll have to watch where I step," he thought. He continued along the path, carefully placing his feet on the ground, watching out for any spikes. Once a set of spikes was revealed, he would step away and walk around them. Suddenly, he lost track of his footing and fell to the ground. But instead of landing on spikes, he fell into an area that was hollowed out. He looked around and then suddenly a creature came out from the wall. Mono jumped back, afraid the creature would attack him. "Do not be afraid of me," the creature said. "Yes, there are vicious creatures who would eat you up down here, but not me. I am a friend." "Okay," Mono said, hesitant to trust them. "What's your name?" "I am known as Midwife," the creature responded. "May I ask what a young child like yourself is doing down here in a place like this?" "Well, I don't know. I'm looking for my friend. They have a grayish-bluish cloak and they have a white shell with a pair of small horns. Have you seen them?" Mono asked. "Ah, you've met the knight," Midwife said. "You know them?" "Yes, they've come down here to talk to me quite a few times," Midwife replied. "Oh, we've had wonderful conversations down here. I suppose I could tell you about them, but oh, I am so very hungry." Suddenly, Midwife's mask opened up, revealing her mouth, and she tried to devour Mono. Mono leapt back and pulled out his ladle. He delivered a smack to Midwife's face and she retreated into her hole. "I need to get out of this place," he thought. He climbed back up through the hole he fell through and turned on his light. He wandered around looking for his companion or a way out of here. He wandered through many tunnels and was about to give up, but then he saw the face of the knight looking right at him. "Hey. It's me," he yelled. But the knight just ran off into a tunnel, leaving him behind. "Hey. Wait up," Mono yelled, running after them. He ran through the caverns and then came to a tunnel where he could no longer hear the sounds of the hostile bugs in Deepnest. He continued to search for his friend and then saw them at the end of the tunnel. Mono walked towards them, but they leapt down another tunnel, leaving him behind. "Wait up," Mono yelled, following them. He found himself in more tunnels, with the knight nowhere to be seen. He looked around for them, then found a wall with a hole in it. He looked through the hole and saw the horns of the knight's shell. He pulled out his ladle and broke through the wall. He looked for his companion, but once again they were nowhere to be seen. "Where are they? And why are they running away from me?" Mono thought to himself as he looked for them. He turned a corner and saw the knight running down a long tunnel and leaping down a hole. Mono chased after them, curious to find out what was wrong with them. He leapt down the hole and found themselves in yet another long tunnel. They walked down the tunnel, looking for his friend. Suddenly, he heard a sound from behind him. He looked and found out that something had blocked him from the other side of the tunnel. Mono continued down the tunnel as more spikes sealed off the rest of the tunnel. Eventually, he came to the end of the tunnel and into a large room. He looked around and saw that there were several corpses of bugs. There was a corpse of one of the bugs he had first encountered when he came out of the television, a corpse of one of the large creatures that he found in the beast's den with the knight, and in the middle of the room, the knight was standing there, waiting for him. "Hey, why did you leave me?" Mono asked, walking towards the knight. "Were you trying to lead me to this place?" he asked. "Why are there so many corpses here?" The knight was silent as he asked his questions, so he got closer. "Did you hear me? Why did you leave?" Suddenly, the knight's head cracked far to the side and let out a hostile roar. "Ch1Ch4. Nosk." Mono watched in fear as the knight's head cracked to the side. "What is happening?" he thought. The knight's head cracked upside down, its body grew taller, a bubble of orange goo swelled up from underneath them, 6 legs sprouted from the bubble and grew in size. The beast gave a roar, revealing its true form. It looked down at Mono and charged towards him. Mono quickly leapt out of the way to avoid the creature's charge and began to run. He fell through a hole and wound up in another tunnel. He heard the beast's cry above him and he quickly started running down the tunnel. He heard a loud crash behind him and he saw that the beast had followed him down the hole. Mono ran for his life as the creature crawled through the tunnel, its jaws snapping at him. Mono came to a point where the tunnel was elevated and began to climb the wall. He continued running as the creature jumped up towards him and continued chasing after him. The creature yelled and several bubbles of orange goo blast from its own. Mono did his best to avoid the goo and continued running. He found a small hole that was too small for the creature to fur in. He jumped down and heard the creature yell out. The tunnel was small and narrow. He couldn't stand up, so he crawled through. As he did though, he heard the creature crawling above him and suddenly, bubbles of orange goo fell through the roof of his tunnel. Mono's hand slipped onto one of the bubbles and he instantly felt enormous pain surge through him. He pulled his hand away and continued to crawl through the tunnel, avoiding the orange goo as best he could. He came to the end of the tunnel and climbed out. He found himself in an open room with another tunnel at the end of it. Suddenly, the wall behind him shattered as the creature broke through. Mono yelped and ran as fast as he could to the tunnel, with the creature hot on his tail. He swerved through the tunnel, trying to escape the beast, but the creature kept breaking through the walls, getting closer to him by the second. Mono came to another wall and climbed it as fast as he could. The creature tried to snap at him, but he was too far away. The creature started to jump up the ledges, trying to catch up to Mono. Luckily, Mono reached the top of the wall, and right in front of him was a giant boulder. He looked and saw the creature close behind him, and thinking quickly, he started pushing the boulder towards the ledge of the wall. He struggled to push, but managed to summon all of his strength and pushed the boulder down the wall. He heard the creature yelp as the boulder fell, and then heard a loud squish as the boulder fell to the ground. Mono looked and saw that the creature was dead and that its shell lay broken next to the boulder. It was then Mono realized what he just crushed. No, it wasn't them, it couldn't have been. He thought to himself. It can't be them, right? He thought. Mono walked down the cavern on the top of the wall. He didn't want to stay here any longer. This place was insane. He wanted to find the knight, he wanted to get out, he wanted to find Six. He turned on his light and continued to wander the caverns in search of a way out. Mono looked around and saw 2 bugs. They were plump and they were standing on 2 legs. One of them had a horn, the other one didn't. Mono inched closer to see if they were friendly, but once he got too close, the bugs turned around, revealing their orange eyes to him. One of the bugs screamed and started running towards Mono, swiping its hands. The other bug leaned down and charged at him with their horn ready to stab him. Mono pulled out his ladle and fought back against the two hostile bugs. He batted the first one away, then slammed his ladle onto the horned one, and orange liquid burst from inside them. The other bug was running back to him, so Mono swung his ladle right at the bug's face, knocking it over, and then slammed it onto the bug with brute force. Orange goo burst out as the bug was squished by his ladle, and then Mono turned to the other bug and finished it off as well. He looked at the corpses of the bugs he had just killed. What is going on? He thought. And what is this orange stuff? Suddenly, one of the corpses started to wiggle. Mono whipped his head towards the corpses, and the second one started to wiggle as well. Then, 8 long legs rose up from the inside of the bug's corpses, along with 8 teeth. They charged at Mono, and without trying to defend himself, Mono ran away. Turns out that was the worst thing to do because as he ran, more hostile bugs noticed him and charged after him. More bugs came up from the ground and tried to bite him, some bugs were latched onto walls and started firing orange goo at him, small bugs saw him run by and chased after him, and corpses of bugs that he passed grew legs like the other ones and started chasing him. Mono continued to run, with only one thought running through his mind. Don't stop running, don't stop running, don't stop running. He thought as he ran from the hostile bugs. He kept on running through tunnels, climbing up walls, and leaping down holes to try and lose the horde of bugs, but they simply just followed him, with their jaws snapping. Suddenly, Mono came to a dead end. Oh no, 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 you gotta be kidding me, he yelled as he ran towards the dead end, with nowhere else to go. He turned around and saw the multiple hostile bugs, ready to devour his body whole. With no way to fight them all, and no way to escape, Mono covered his eyes and braced himself for his death. Suddenly, the earth above them burst open, and a huge blast of black and white energy fell upon the horde of bugs. Mono uncovered his eyes and looked in front of him. There were these black particles floating everywhere, orange goo covered the walls coming from the corpses of the bugs, and standing right in front of him was a familiar face. The figure walked closer, and Mono stared in shock. How can it be? Surely it's not, are they? He thought with his mind racing. It was the night. The night walked closer and offered its hand to help Mono up, just like he had done to help the night before. The H1CH5. Reunited with a new friend. The night climbed up towards the Stag station, where it planned to ride to Dirtmouth, and there Mono would be safe. But once they got to the Stag station, it was blocked off by several boulders. It was confused, but it needed to find another way out of here. It looked at its map and planned out a route. The best way to go would be to leave through Queen's Gardens. That area would be somewhat safe, and it wasn't too far from here. The knight looked back to check on Mono, but for some reason, he wasn't there. The knight walked out of the Stag station and looked around for its missing companion, but they were nowhere to be found. The knight figured that Mono must have fallen, and it didn't hear them. It leapt down and fell into the black water beneath a distant village. The knight got out of the water and began to search for Mono. It looked around and saw many traps activated. Mono had definitely been through here. The knight made its way down to Midwife, wondering if she had seen him. Upon arriving in her cavern, Midwife came out of her hole and began to speak. "Oh, hello there, little knight," she said. "It's so good to see you again. You know, there was a boy who was looking for you. He wore a little bag over his head and had a brown coat. Although I think I scared him off with my hunger. Speaking of which, could you stand still for a small moment while I..." The knight quickly leapt back to avoid Midwife's jaws. They climbed out of the hole and began to look for Mono. The knight immediately realized how painful it was to be in Deepnest without a light. They couldn't see much, and they were often attacked from behind. Luckily, even without a light source, it could handle the enemies of Deepnest. The knight wandered around, looking for Mono for a while, until it heard a familiar voice underneath them. The knight immediately recognized the voice as Mono's, and it recognized the sounds that followed. There were several bugs underneath it, most likely after Mono. The knight quickly used their descending dark ability to break through the floor beneath them and eliminated all the enemies. Once the dust cleared, it looked in front of them to see Mono, curled up in a ball, covering his eyes. As the knight stepped towards him, he removed his hands and stared at them. The knight then offered its hand to help Mono to his feet, just like he had done to help them to its feet back in the beast's den. Mono looked at the knight with a confused stare, then took its hand, and the knight helped him back up to his feet. "I don't understand," Mono said. "How are you alive?" The knight turned its head in a confused way. Did Mono think it had died? "I found you, but you turned into this monster and tried to eat me, and then I slammed a boulder on you, so how are you alive?" Mono asked, frantically. Understanding what had happened, the knight pulled out the hunter's journal and then flipped to the page that read, Nosk. It showed to page to Mono, and he started to read it. "So, that wasn't you?" Mono asked, once he had finished reading. The knight shook their head as in no. That beast must have appeared as you to try and lure me into its den, Mono said, and he let out a heavy sigh. Thank goodness you're still alive. Do you still know a way out of here? He asked. The knight nodded and then used the monarch wings to jump up back through the hole it had made with descending dark. I can't do that, Mono yelled up to the knight. The knight jumped back down the hole and offered its hands to try and boost Mono up through the hole. For some reason, he was hesitant to accept the offer, but soon, he got on the knight's hands and it boosted him up through the hole. It jumped out of the hole itself and then motioned Mono to follow them. Mono stayed close behind this time, not wanting to get lost or run into any more terrifying bugs. He turned on his flashlight and the two made their way through Deepnest. They were quite delayed, but they were still pretty close to the exit that lead to Queen's Gardens. The knight led Mono through the tunnels of Deepnest and quickly defeated enemies that dared to approach them. Soon, they got to the area directly below Queen's Gardens and they both started to make their way upwards. Once they got to the room below the exit, they were ambushed by 3 little weavers. The knight drew its nail and began to attack the 2 weavers that were headed towards it. Once they were defeated, they looked back at Mono and was a little bit surprised to see that he had defeated a weaver all by himself. So Mono did know how to fight. Although his weapon was questionable. He fought the weaver with a soup ladle that was almost as large as him. However, the ladle got the job done, so the knight didn't judge them. Are we almost out of here? Mono asked. I can't take this place much longer. The knight nodded and pointed upwards. The two climbed up to the top of the room and then made their way into Queen's Gardens. Once they got there, Mono let out a massive sigh of relief. I am never going back down into there, he said. The knight looked around at Queen's Gardens and almost instantly realized that something was off. There were no bugs around the area at all. There should have been a few spiny husks around the area along with some moss flies, but for some reason, there were almost no bugs in sight. Not to mention, the air looked a little more foggy than usual. The knight and Mono walked forwards and what the two of them saw next was shocking. There were several traps, each one filled to the brim with rotting corpses of bugs and humans. PH1CH6. Traps and obstacles. Mono looked at the sea of dead bugs and humans rotting inside of nets. So there are actual people here too. He thought. He looked over and saw the knight walk over to a net and poke it with its nail. I think they're dead, Mono said. He didn't know if the knight was checking to see if they were alive or not, but he still felt like he should say something. The knight walked over to a dead human and started to look at it. Has it never seen a human except me before? Mono thought as he walked over to his friend. Should we keep moving? He asked. The knight nodded and the two started moving forward. Mono looked around. This place looked somewhat familiar to him. I mean sure, he had never seen these kinds of plants before or these bugs, but the fogginess of this place reminded him of a forest he had been to once. Not only that, but it was also the way the traps were made in this place that seemed familiar to him. Traps like those were made by the oh no. He thought once he realized who set the traps. His mind snapped back to reality as he heard the sound of a falling tree. He looked behind him and saw the trunk of a tree rolling towards him and the knight. Run! He yelled out. Mono and the knight sprinted as fast as they could to avoid the log, although it was clear to Mono that he was not fast enough to make it. Suddenly, he felt a push behind his back, sending him far ahead. He looked behind him and saw the knight was about to be crushed by the log. No! He yelled, but to his surprise, the knight dashed forwards in a burst of black energy, sending it right next to Mono. The trunk ran into a sturdy tree and stopped rolling towards them. Mono took a deep breath of relief. Thank goodness that's over. He thought, but he stayed alert. He knew that the hunter set traps almost anywhere he could. And based on the nets that he and the knight saw when they first entered, he was 100% sure that the hunter was in this area. But something didn't sit right. He and Six killed the hunter. They shot him themselves. Didn't they? Mono stopped focusing on the thoughts in his head and instead focused on the path he and the knight were on, looking out for any traps. Suddenly, he spotted a thin tripwire right in front of them. He pulled the knight behind him and then pressed his ladle onto the tripwire. Almost instantly, a cage fell down where they would have been if Mono hadn't realized the wire in time. The two continued walking and the knight drew its nail, no aware of the possible traps ahead of them. They kept walking until they came to a pit full of spikes with a few platforms ahead of them. Mono almost leapt on the platforms, but the knight stopped him. It then went ahead and leapt on the platforms itself. Mono then saw what it was trying to tell him. A few seconds after it stepped on each platform, they would drop, causing them to fall into the spikes. Once the platforms were brought back up, Mono quickly leapt on each platform, careful not to fall into the spikes. Once on the other side, he looked at the knight for a while. The two of them made a surprisingly good team. Mono knew the hunter's traps and the knight knew most of the obstacles that had to face. The two of them continued forwards, ready to face whatever was coming next. They came to an area with the floor covered in leaves. Mono instantly recognized this trap and looked around for something he could throw. He found a few pairs of shoes, most likely from the people who were caught in the traps, picked one up and threw it into the leaves. Once the shoe landed and chain reaction of bear traps went off, the knight realized what Mono was doing and used its nail to hit a shoe farther into the leaves, causing more bear traps to go off. With a more comfortable path in front of them, the two walked forwards and came to a green lake. Mono looked closer and saw that the green water in the lake was bubbling. It was then he realized that it was not water that was in the lake, but rather acid. While he tried to figure out a way across, the knight leapt into the acid without hesitation. To Mono's surprise, the acid was repelled from the knight and it swam across the lake with no problem at all. Once it got to the other side, it pulled a lever and a bridge of platforms sprung up from the side. Mono walked across and the two pressed forwards. They came to another lake, but this time with no bridge to be activated on the other side. Mono looked around for something they could use and spotted a wooden crate. Curious to see if it would work, he pushed the crate into the lake of acid. Surprisingly, it floated and wasn't being destroyed by the acid. Mono hopped onto the top of the crate and the knight dove into the acid and swam across the lake, pushing the crate along with it. The knight pushed Mono on the crate for quite some time and then they came to the other side of the lake. Mono got out of the crate, the knight climbed out of the lake and they both walked forwards, awaiting what was next. As they were walking, a trap suddenly activated, trapping them in a room. But this trap wasn't made by the hunter. Mono knew the hunter's traps and this was not one of them. However, he stopped thinking about who made the trap when suddenly a mantis came out of the ground and started attacking them. Mono leapt away from the mantis's claws and the knight struck them with its nail twice, defeating them. However, once that mantis was defeated, another one came up from the ground and two other ones came from the sky, flying. Mono pulled out his ladle and stood at the knight's side. It was time for battle. VH1CH7. Mantis Traders. Mono stood beside the knight as the mantises drew near. Once close enough, the mantis on the ground thrust forwards, swiping at the two of them. Mono and the knight leapt away and struck the mantis with their weapons. But the mantis leapt upwards and then slashed down at the knight, striking it. Once the mantis landed, Mono made sure to finish them off as a punishment for hurting his friend. But now that the first mantis was down, they had to deal with the two in the air. The two mantises swiped and discs of hot white energy emerged from their claws. Mono leapt over the discs and then rushed towards the two mantises. He swiped at them with his ladle, but they were out of his reach. The mantises swiped again, with two discs headed right for Mono. He jumped out of the way and the knight leapt up to the two bugs, striking them with its nail. Following the knight's example, Mono leapt up to the mantises and slammed his ladle down on one of them with full force, crushing it as a burst of orange goo came from its body. The knight jumped up to the last mantis and finished it off with its nail. The two paused to take a few breaths once all mantises were defeated. "What were those?" Mono asked the knight. The knight pulled out its journal again and showed Mono 2 pages. One was titled Mantis Petra and another was titled Mantis Trader, with pictures resembling the very bugs the two just fought. Mono read about them for a while, then turned to the knight. "Did you write this?" he asked it. The knight shook its head. "Wait, if you didn't write it, then who did?" The knight flipped to the cover of the book and showed Mono the title. Mono was in shock as he saw the title, The Hunter's Journal. "You got this from the hunter?" he asked, in shock. The knight nodded. "But how? I was so sure I killed him. I literally shot him with a gun," Mono yelled. The knight tilted its head in confusion. It was clear to Mono that the knight didn't have a clue what he was talking about. "Wait, did you get it from someone who wore a sack over their head?" Mono asked, thinking he knew why the knight was so confused. The knight shook its head and Mono got his answer. "Sorry," he said. "It's just that there's someone I know called the Hunter, so I assumed the hunter you were referring to was him." The knight shrugged and put the journal away. They both walked forwards, now with the gates opened up to the path ahead. They walked into an area covered with thorns and these weird flying bugs that were covered in moss. Mono drew his ladle to fight them, but the knight put its hand on the ladle, lowering it down, as if it was telling him that these bugs weren't too much of a threat. They climbed down the area, making sure to avoid the thorns and to avoid the little mossfies. Once they got to the bottom, they found themselves in a room with a few bugs that were also covered in moss, but this time were similar to the corpses that Mono saw in Deepnest. The knight drew its nail and advanced towards the bugs. Once it got too close, thorns came up from the moss on the bugs and shot out in all directions. Mono and the knight avoided the shooting thorns and the knight defeated the bugs with a few swift strikes from its nail. Mono started to walk forward, but the knight held him back. At first, Mono was confused but then saw thorns stick out from the corpses of the bugs. He smashed the corpses with his ladle and the two continued ahead. They came down into another room filled with dropping platforms. Mono made sure to be quick in getting from one platform to the other to make sure not to fall into the thorns underneath them. Suddenly, a Mantis Petra appeared in front of them and flung its discs towards Mono. Before they could hit, the knight jumped in front of Mono, taking the blow instead. Mono was about to check on the knight to see if it was okay, but they had stayed on the platform for too long and it dropped. Mono fell onto another platform and decided he'd better find solid ground. He leapt across the platforms, avoiding the mantis's discs, and found a ledge where he could stand without fear of getting dropped into thorns. He looked back up at the mantis and saw the knight leaping towards it, defeating it with its nail. The knight made their way down to Mono and looked to see if he was okay. "Are you alright?" Mono asked. "You got hit by that disc." The knight nodded, but Mono still felt like they should find a way to rest and heal up. Suddenly, the knight crouched down and a white energy spiraled around them as their wounds began to heal. "Are you okay?" Mono asked again. The knight nodded, this time with full honesty. Mono felt relaxed now that he knew his friends was okay and the two started climbing down to the ground. When they got there, Mono almost fell into the thorns, but the knight caught his hand and pulled him up. Mono then got a flashback of him and Six venturing through the forest together. He leapt for her hand and she caught him, pulling him up. His memories then traced back to the signal tower where he leapt for her hand again, but this time she dropped him. He snapped himself out of the memory, not wanting to relive that horrible experience again, and followed the knight. He was very glad to have it as his friend and he was especially glad that it hadn't let go. The two made their way through the gardens and found themselves in an elevated room. They worked together to climb up and found themselves in a place Mono did not want to be. A place where all of his nightmares started. A place where everything could have possibly been prevented. A place he never wished to see again. They were standing right in front of the hunter's house. The H1CH8. The hunter. The knight stood next to Mono in front of the old wrecked house. It looked abandoned, but there was a light inside so someone had to have been living there. It didn't know what to expect, as far as it knew, Mono did not want to go in there, based on his frozen still form and shocked stare. The knight reached for Mono's hand, grabbing it. Mono looked over and the knight gave a slow nod to try and say, "Everything will be okay." It was not going to let anything happen to him here. It had already lost one friend to the wrath of Queen's Gardens, it was not going to lose another. Mono nodded back and reluctantly led the knight to an open window in the hunter's home. They climbed through and the knight looked around. There was definitely someone here. There was a pot of stew cooking on an active stove and tea was brewing on the spot next to it on the stove. The knight looked to Mono and he whispered to it to follow him. It followed him into a very unsettling room. There were people sitting around a table, but they were stitched, stuffed with cotton. The knight looked for Mono and saw him entering vent on the wall of the room. The knight followed Mono into a room with a ladder hanging on the roof. It looked for Mono to see him standing underneath the ladder. The knight walked over to him and he pointed to the handle on the end of the ladder. The knight used its monarch wings to fly up to the handle and pull the ladder down. The two of them climbed up into the attic of the house and Mono led the knight to a large box. Mono tried to push it, but it were too heavy for him to move alone. The knight walked over and helped its friend push the bow towards the wall, and once it was at the end, they got on top of it and moved to what was on the other side of the boxes. The knight looked around and saw a key hanging on a hook. It made an attempt to get the key, but it was out of reach, even with the monarch wings. It looked for a way to get the key down and then saw that Mono had gone missing. The knight looked around for its friend and found him trying to pull a handle from a dead woman's hand. The knight struck the arm of the woman and to its surprise, the arm fell off, revealing cotton and stitches holding the arm in place. Mono picked up the handle from the stuffed woman's hand and walked back to the room with the key. He put the handle into the slot of a pulley machine and then motioned for the knight to get on the sack that was tied to a rope. The knight got on the sack and Mono pulled the handle, lifting the knight upwards towards the key. The knight jumped off of the sack and struck the hook with its nail, causing the key to fall off. Mono picked up the key and started to walk back to the ladder. The two of them climbed down from the attic and Mono slipped the key into a locked door. The door opened up and the two were outside. Mono guided the knight to a shed and inside were piles of crates. The knight helped Mono push a large crate to a wall and they both climbed up and went through an open latch in the wall. The knight realized how quiet Mono was during all of this. Normally he was talkative and asking questions, but during this entire time, he remained silent. The knight didn't know why its friend was this quiet, but judging on the petrified stance he had when they came to the house, it figured that being in this place scared him. Mono crouched down and signaled for the knight to do the same. It did exactly that and the two slowly walked into another room. The knight looked and saw a large person, covered in orange infection bubble, sewing something with thread and then stuffing it with cotton. It inched a little bit closer and saw that this person was wearing a sack over its head. This was no doubt the hunter that Mono was talking about earlier. "Not him again," Mono whispered. The knight took Mono's hand again, reassuring its friend that everything was going to be okay. Mono looked back at the knight and then they both slowly moved past the hunter's desk as it worked on its taxidermy. They came to a dog hatch and started to push. Unfortunately, that made noise and the hunter turned its head towards both of them. They pushed through the door and landed in a pile of junk. The hunter quickly walked through the door with a large gun in his hand. "Run!" Mono yelled and the two made a break for it. Mono quickly hid behind a wooden crate and the knight dashed over to them. The hunter shot the box, shattering it but protecting them from the bullet. Mono and the knight ran towards another crate and managed to avoid the hunter's shot yet again. They ran to another one, but this time the hunter threw a bear trap at Mono. The trap landed right in front of him and his foot got caught in the trap. Mono screamed out in pain as the hunter readied his gun. But once it shot, the knight swung its nail, hitting the bullet away from its injured friend. The hunter turned his attention towards the knight and aimed his gun at it. The knight dashed away once it fired and then struck the hunter with its nail several times. The hunter screamed out and the orange bubbles on him spread further, covering his sack, jacket and gun. The hunter aimed and this time fired 3 shots at once due to the effects of the infection. The knight dashed away and fired a shade soul at the hunter to counterattack. The hunter stomped the ground and several bear traps came up from the earth. The knight used its descending darkness to get rid of the traps and then dashed away from the hunter's bullets. Getting annoyed, the hunter threw a large bag full of cotton and infection bubbles at the knight. Once it landed, it exploded into a burst of orange energy. The knight got caught in the explosion and lost 2 of its 6 masks of health. The knight shook off the blow and then moved towards the hunter, striking it multiple times with its nail. It dashed to the back of the hunter and then started to burst the bubbles of infection of his back. The hunter turned to face the knight, but that was a mistake on his part. Once he turned towards the knight, it let out an abyss shriek, bursting all the bubbles of infection on his head. The hunter screamed as a big burst of infection erupted from his body and fell to the ground in defeat. The knight had won. PH1CH9. Rancid Stew. The knight looked back at Mono, who was now collapsed due to blood loss. The knight removed the bear trap from Mono's leg and began to search for a place to put his injured friend. The knight picked Mono up, carrying them on its shoulders, and looked around for a place they could rest. It walked around the foggy gardens, searching so a small room, tunnel or hidden area that it could use as a place for Mono to heal. It wandered around for a while and then found a small cavern hidden from the rest of the gardens. It looked perfect. The knight walked over to the cavern, walked inside and laid Mono down on the grass of the cavern. It then walked outside and began to cut down leaves and vines. It brought its materials back to Mono and got to work. It placed the leaves around Mono's wound, then tied it all up with a vine, holding the leaves in place. For extra precaution, it found some hard flat stones and made a splint for Mono's leg just in case he had broken a bone. It sat down and waited for Mono to wake up. While it was waiting, it heard a sound coming from Mono's stomach. He must have been hungry. The knight didn't get too hungry as it didn't need to eat, but Mono was different. The knight looked through its materials, searching for something that it could use to feed Mono once he woke up. There wasn't much to work with, only a few rancid eggs and a comb of honey. While thinking of a way to make something that was actually good to eat, it remembered a recipe that Tuck taught them a while ago. If it could remember what the recipe was, it was called Rancid Stew and required fungal mushrooms from the mushroom caverns, some herbs from the Queen's gardens, a tiny drop of acid to remove the negative effects of the rancid eggs, and a comb of honey from the hive. The knight couldn't make too much of a detour, but luckily it had access to most of the ingredients. It already had the eggs and the honey, it needed to get the herbs and acid, which could luckily all be found in the Queen's gardens, and there was a shortcut into the fungal wastes nearby which it could use to get some mushrooms. It ventured out of the cavern and looked for what it needed. It found a small pool of acid nearby and it dipped its nail into it. It only needed a drop of acid, so it could get that from the acid dropping off its nail. However, it would need to do that on the way back. The knight walked around, looking for the herbs, and found a few of them near the hunter's house. It took what it needed and looked inside of the hunter's home to see if it could find some pots to use for making the stew. It found a small pot inside a cabinet that looked perfect for the job. The knight left the hunter's home and then began the trek to the fungal wastes. The knight wanted to get there as soon as possible in order to be back in time for Mono to wake up. It also didn't want to leave him alone for too long, worried that some Mantis Traders would find him or if the infection would take hold of him. The knight quickly made their way down to the fungal wastes, gathered up a few mushrooms, and started quickly moving back to the cavern where it had left Mono. The knight made sure to avoid contact with enemies as best it could because it could lose some of its ingredients and it could get slowed down. Luckily, the knight made their way back to the cavern without any obstacles and began to prepare the stew. It struck its nail against a rock, causing sparks that fell onto some rocks which it had covered in acid. The fire lit well, and the knight placed the pot on top of the rocks. It cracked open the rancid eggs, and an absolutely horrible smell emitted from them. The knight a small waterfall near them and used it to fill the pot with water. It placed the pot back on the fire and began to continue the recipe. They grounded up the herbs and sprinkled them into the stew. It sliced up the mushrooms and put those in as well. The knight took its honeycomb and squeezed some drops of honey into the stew, and once that was done, it went outside to the pond of acid, dipped its nail in, and rushed back to the cavern to get one drop of acid inside the stew. With the meal smelling much better now, the knight took Mono's ladle, cleaned it off, and began stirring the stew. Not much later, the knight heard Mono grunting. He woke up and looked around the cavern. "What happened?" he asked. And, sniff, what's that smell? The knight took the small pot off of the fire and offered it to Mono. He looked at the stew for a while, then looked back at the knight. "Is that for me?" he asked. The knight nodded, put the rancid stew down in front of him, and handed Mono his ladle. Mono lifted up his paper bag and started to shovel the stew into his mouth. The knight sat down and watched its friend eat. It had done a good job on making the stew. Mono quickly finished, wiped his mouth, and pulled his paper bag back over his head. "Thanks," he said. The knight nodded, trying to say, "You're welcome." "Man, none of this makes sense," Mono suddenly said. The knight tilted its head in confusion. "Why is the hunter still alive? How was he much stronger than before? What is going on?" Mono asked, a bit of panic in his voice. "Do you know what's going on?" he asked the knight. The knight just stared at Mono as it tried to find a way to answer. "Oh, right, you can't speak," Mono said. "I wish you could just write down what you wanted to say or something." Upon hearing that, the knight pulled a leaf up from the cavern, took out its quill, and began to write. Once it was finished, it tapped Mono's shoulder and showed him the leaf. Mono looked at the leaf and read what the knight wrote. "I think it might be because of the infection," he read aloud. "Infection? What infection?" The knight pulled off another leaf and wrote some more. It had a lot to write about, but at least it found a way to communicate with Mono. It handed him the leaf and Mono read aloud. "This infection appears in the dreams of the citizens and drives them mad, turning them into hostile creatures and making them stronger," he read. "But can it bring people back to life?" The knight wrote on another leaf and Mono read it aloud. "I don't remember it being able to do that, but the infection seems to have gotten stronger with all of these weird devices popping up lately," Mono read. Mono stared at the knight and spoke in a slightly worried tone. "I think that might be the signal tower," he said. The knight tilted its head to the side and Mono began to explain. "The signal tower broadcasts these signals through TVs and all the people who watch them become controlled by it," he explained. "But it needs a host to work, so who could be its host?" The knight stared at Mono. "It just might know who. PH1CH10. A new power." Mono sat still in the cavern, thinking about the signal tower and this infection going around. None of it made sense to him. The signal tower needed a host, or else it couldn't work. But since the Thin Man was defeated and he and Six escaped, the signal tower shouldn't have a host. He couldn't think anymore, he needed to find answers. He tried to stand up but felt a searing pain in his leg. He looked down and saw his left leg was bandaged up with leaves, vines and stones around the area where the bear trap was. The knight rushed over to help Mono walk, offering its nail as a walking stick. "Thanks," he said, taking it. "By the way, is there anything I can call you? You know, like a name?" The knight took another leaf and wrote down Knight. "Alright, that's a little bland, but it works," Mono said. The knight led him out of the cavern and the two of them walked through Queen's Gardens. Mono looked at the knight. It cared about him a lot. It bandaged his leg, made him something to eat, found a safe place for him to rest, and now it was giving up its main weapon of defense and attack just so he could walk. Mono smiled underneath his bag. He hadn't felt this good while adventuring since he was with Six. His mind traced through his memories back to the day he first met her. The times he saved her, the trust they had built, the challenges they overcame, and the times they spent together. He missed her a lot. Once they found a way out of this place and stopped the signal tower, the first thing he wanted to do was look for her. She wasn't very good at fighting enemies, and in a world as hostile as this, she would be as good as dead without his help. He followed the knight, limping with its nail, and they came to a bench. The bench had these white particles floating around it and they felt warm and comforting. The knight moved him over to the bench and motioned for him to sit down. Mono didn't know why he should, but the knight clearly knew what this was, so he trusted it. Once he sat down, he felt a warm tingling feeling in his leg. It felt weird, but very relaxing, and almost all his pain went away. The knight started to remove the vines and leaves, and Mono stared in shock. His wound had disappeared. It was as if by magic. Mono stood up, now being able to fully walk on his own, and filled with happiness. He looked at the knight, who was holding its hand out for something. Mono remembered its nail, and handed it back to them. The knight put its nail behind its back, and the two of them started off yet again. As they walked there was almost nothing attacking them. Everything that was bad just seemingly disappeared. They came to what looked like a ruined temple, and walked inside. They walked through the temple, until Mono felt a sudden surge of pain into his head. He looked, and saw an active TV, to his left. Gotta tame the transmission. He thought as he walked towards the TV, holding out his left hand. He placed his hand on the TV screen, and began the process. But as he tamed the transmission, he felt like he was being sucked into the TV. Not wanting to end up stuck inside of wherever this TV led, Mono tried to pull his hand away from the screen. As he pulled, he felt a glitch consume his arm, spreading to the rest of his body. He pulled with all his might, and the TV screen broke as he ripped his hand away from it. Mono opened his eyes, and he read this sound all around him. It was like a radio, combined with the static of a TV. He looked down at his hand, and saw that it was gray, and glitching just like a glitch on a screen. He looked at the knight, as it tried to grab his hand to comfort him. But the knight's hand went right through Mono, as if he was a ghost. No, 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 I don't want to be like this. Mono screamed in his mind, closing his eyes. Instantly, the radio sound stopped. Mono opened his eyes, and looked down at his hands. They were normal. Thank God. He thought, and he breathed a heavy sigh of relief. The knight walked towards him, checking to see if he was okay, with its hand reached out. Everything's fine, I'm alright now, he said. The knight nodded, and continued to lead Mono through the temple. They came to a locked door, with no key in sight. They both looked around for a key, until they came to a room with a key, stuck on the roof. The knight made an attempt to climb up the walls and grab it, but they were too slippery to climb. Mono looked, and saw a ladder, that looked like it was glitched. He tried to climb it, but his hand went right through it when he tried to grab it. Suddenly, a crazy idea popped into his head. He focused his mind, and thought, glitch. He heard the radio static noise again, and was back in the glitched state. He reached for the ladder again, and this time he could grab it. He climbed up the ladder, and came to the roof, where the key was stuck. He tried to reach it, but suddenly a burning pain came from his head. He tried to make it stop, but the radio static got louder, and the pain kept on growing. Stop. He thought, and he started to fall. He quickly grabbed the key, and brought it down with him as he hit the hard ground. The knight walked over to him, checking to see if he was hurt. I'm fine, he said. I guess I can't stay glitched like that for too long. The knight helped him to his feet, and he picked up the key. The two of them walked over to the door, and Mono slipped the key in place, unlocking the door. They walked out of the temple, and Mono's mind raced about this new power he had just gained. Perhaps it could be helpful, but at the same time, it could also result in his death. He clenched his fist, determined to not let this new power kill him, and he continued forward with the knight. The H1CH11. Entering Fog Canyon. As Mono and the knight walked along through the gardens, he couldn't help but think about this newfound power of his. Could it result in his death? Could it turn him into a glitched remain? Either way, he did not want to find out. What mattered now was getting to the signal tower and shutting it down. As he walked along the path, he saw something that looked like a glitched vine, leading down into a hole. Curiosity got the better of him, and he went to go investigate. Before he could touch the vine, however, he felt the knight pulling on his hand. Don't worry, I won't be too long, Mono assured. I just want to see where this is leading. The knight let go of his hand, and Mono glitched. He climbed down the vine, careful not to slip and fall, and to not stay glitched for too long. When the pain in his head was getting a little too strong, he had already reached the end of the vine, so he got off and glitched back to reality. He looked around the room he was now in, and one thing caught his eye. A bug, much larger than him and his friend. It was surrounded by these black tentacles that seemed to be inactive, and it had what seemed to be black tears coming down from their eyes. Mono inched closer, and saw they were holding a key. Thinking it might be useful, he pulled the key from the bug's cold, dead hands. The handle of the key was shaped like a heart and was padded with nice, soft substance. Mono slipped the key into his jacket and walked towards the vine. He glitched himself again and climbed out of the hole. Once he was out and back in reality, the knight looked at him with a concerned gaze. There was almost nothing down there, he told his friend. Although I did find this, he said, pulling out the key. Maybe it could be useful later. The knight nodded and continued walking along. Mono walked along with it, and the two came to a large lake of acid with a huge cluster of thorns hanging above it. How am I going to get over there? He thought. The thorns are hanging too low for me to float over on a crate, and I can't swim in acid, so how can I get across? He looked at the lake and saw a glitched boat. This power of his was going to come in handy for a long time. The boat was hanging deep in the acid but was still floating high enough to pass under the thorns. Mono glitched into the boat and the knight jumped into the acid and started swimming across. Mono leaned forward on his boat and it drifted to the other side of the lake. He was getting the hang of using this power and when he got to the other side, his head wasn't hurting at all. The knight climbed out of the acid and the two of them walked down a foggy tunnel. As they walked, the fog seemed to cut deeper and deeper until it got to the point where Mono couldn't see where he was going anymore. Before he knew it, he ran into a wall. As he got back to his feet, he felt the knight's hand grab his own, pulling him along. Mono instantly got flashbacks of him and Six when they first held hands. He pulled her along with him and she followed and they both grew a trust between them as they navigated the Pale City. As the fog faded, Mono was drawn out of his flashback. He was able to see where he was going now and then looked at the place he and the knight had entered. The place looked beautiful. While there was still a large amount of fog covering the area, it seemed to amplify the glow this place had. It had small bushes of greenery and these bubbles that stuck to the walls and floors of the place. The knight led him through the fog and they came across some small jellyfish. They were so small and cute and Mono reached out his hand to touch one. Once he did though, he felt a sting in his hand. He pulled it away and saw that the jellyfish was buzzing with electricity. Mono continued following the knight through this canyon and they came to face quite a few large jellyfish. Upon seeing they were infected, Mono pulled out his ladle to attack them. A very bad choice. The knight tried to stop him, but his ladle struck the jellyfish, bursting its skin. Its inside however, zoomed towards him and before it could make contact with him, the knight jumped in front of Mono and an explosion burst out. Mono rushed to his friend, who was blown against the wall, to see if they were alright. Once the knight got to its feet, it whipped out the hunter's journal and shoved a page in Mono's face. He read the page and understood why the knight had tried to stop him. "Sorry," he said. "I didn't know those things exploded." The knight looked down, as if it was annoyed, then put the journal away and continued forward. They came to a series of tunnels with a bunch of butterflies swirling around. But that wasn't a good thing. Once the butterflies got in large groups, they created a big shock of electricity around them. The knight dashed through the butterflies with a spark of black energy, but Mono was confused for how he should cross. He suddenly remembered his power and glitched through all the butterflies. After they left that area, they came to an upwards tunnel filled with small and big jellyfish. Careful not to touch the big ones this time, Mono climbed up the ledges of the tunnel and the knight helped him with jumps too far for him to make. While on the ledge, Mono almost stepped forward but the knight pulled him away as fast as it could. "What is it now?" he asked. The knight pointed to a bubble on the ground. This one was filled with orange goo. The knight unleashed a blast of black energy and the bubble popped, releasing an explosion of orange infection. "I see," Mono said and they continued upwards. Once they got to the top of the tunnel, they walked through a hole big enough for a doorway and Mono looked at the large, glorious, but haunting structure in front of them. PH1CH12. The teacher's archives. The knight looked at the teacher's archives, looming above them. Something about it wasn't right. It was a lot bigger than it was supposed to be. Literally, it was huge. But that wasn't going to stop the knight. It needed to free Monomon and break another seal holding the black egg together. The knight walked towards the entrance and then saw a silhouette of a familiar bug. The knight got closer and instantly recognized it. It ran forward to greet its friend, but the figure disappeared into a glitchy static. The knight stopped running and hung its head down. It wanted to see its old friend again, but unfortunately, they were gone and the knight hadn't seen them since. Suddenly, it was brought to the real world with Mono's voice. "Was that a friend of yours?" he asked. The knight sadly nodded. "What happened to them? Did they die?" The knight didn't know what happened to them itself, so it shrugged. "I'm gonna assume that means you don't know," Mono said. The knight nodded, then led Mono into the teacher's archives. It was definitely different in here. There were wooden planks on the floor instead of the stone, and there was very little light. The knight walked into another room and found several bunk beds stacked on top of each other. It certainly didn't know what was going on here, but it seemed that Mono did. The knight continued walking, and they came to the end of a hall with nothing but a painting of a weird woman. The knight looked for Mono, wondering if he had a solution, but he had already started running back to the other room. The knight followed him, and Mono came running back with a ball in his hands. Mono threw the ball at the painting, and it fell off, revealing a secret passageway. The knight followed Mono through the hole in the wall, and they started to crawl through a long vent. As they crawled, they heard sounds of children laughing and running around. The knight stayed on edge in case something were to attack it or his friend. Once they came to the end of the vent, the knight started walking forward, but suddenly, Mono tackled it to the ground. The knight looked at him in confusion, but then saw a large bucket swung down where the knight would have been standing had Mono not pushed them to the ground. "Be careful," he said to the knight. "There are a lot of traps here." The knight nodded and the two of them continued walking, this time side by side to make sure they were prepared for any sudden attacks. They eventually came to the beginning of a hall and the knight heard the sounds of children giggling and metal clanking. The knight and Mono slowly peeked down the hall and saw 3 children with big heads stuffing a large bucket with several heavy objects. "Not these guys again," Mono whispered, backing away from the hallway. The knight looked at its friend with a concerned look. "These people are bullies," Mono explained. "And that's not an exaggeration, that's literally what they're called. They've given me quite a bit of trouble in the past." The knight looked down at the bullies, stuffing the bucket and then pulling it up so it could slam into someone's head. The knight looked back at Mono and drew its nail. Mono caught on and pulled out his ladle. The two inched across the hallway and one of the bullies spotted them. They screamed out and all 3 of them charged at Mono and the knight with their hands reached out, grabbing for them. The knight swung its nail at the bully closest to it and shockingly, their head broke into pieces. The knight looked at Mono and saw he had defeated the other 2. "Their heads are hollow. One swift strike to the head and they'll break like a pot," Mono explained. The knight nodded and they both pressed forward. They came into another room where there were more bullies and more jellyfish. The bullies threw spitballs at the jellyfish, pulled them from the air and started viciously squeezing them. One of the bullies made the mistake of shooting a spitball at a big jellyfish and its core zoomed towards it and exploded, destroying the entire group. "Glad that's not me anymore," Mono said. They both walked through a door and came to a large empty room. Suddenly, they were ambushed by several bullies, their hands grabbing onto them, trying to pull them away. The knight, however, knew what to do and charged up a nailard. It unleashed the cyclone slash and broke free from the bully's grasps. It rushed over to Mono and swung its nail at the bully's heads, freeing him. The two then proceeded to destroy the rest of the bullies with everything they had. Suddenly, a bully with an orange head ran towards them. Before it could even touch them, the knight shattered its head, revealing an orange bubble of infection. The bully ran around in all directions, looking around for the 2 of them, and Mono thrust his ladle into the bubble of infection on the bully's broken head. But to the surprise of him and the knight, the bubble of infection exploded, sending Mono flying backwards. The knight ran to its injured friend, checking to see if they were still alive. "Should have known," Mono faintly said. "Don't hit the bubbles." The knight pulled Mono onto its shoulder and they both continued forwards. The knight needed to find a place where Mono could rest and heal up. He couldn't focus all like it could after all, so he couldn't heal himself. The knight helped Mono walk through the rooms of the school and they came to a room with a red cross on the door. Inside, they found several bandages and other medical stuff. The knight found another bench with soul particles floating around it and sat Mono down on it. The particles whizzed around Mono as his injuries began to heal and soon he was perfectly fine. With its friend healed, the knight pressed forwards with its friend and they came to another room. But this time, the room wasn't empty. This room had desks aligned in a pattern with a bully sitting in each one. At the front of the room, there was a large woman writing down math equations on a chalkboard. "Oh no," Mono whispered as he looked into the room. The H1CH13. The teacher and her students. Mono quivered as his eyes saw the teacher. He did not like her. She was definitely one of the most creepy, scary, and intimidating creatures in this world. He had escaped her once, but he didn't want to have to escape her again. He backed away from the room, afraid to go near the teacher, but his eyes averted to the eyes of the knight. The knight walked towards him and held his hand once again. It looked at him with reassuring eyes and Mono's bravery returned to him. As long as he had a reason to fight, a friend to be with, he was not going to give up on anything until it was finished. Mono signaled for the knight to crouch down and the 2 of them slowly crawled through the classroom, avoiding the teacher's sight. They crawled into a side room off of the classroom and found a key hanging on a bookshelf. Mono remembered what happened last time and climbed up the bookshelf, careful not to let it fall over. He grabbed the key, shoved it into his pocket and began to slowly climb down. He got to the floor and was relieved to see that the bookshelf hadn't fallen down. Suddenly, his coat got stuck in between the books. He tried getting it out, but once he tried to pull it out, he knew he made a mistake. The bookshelf fell down towards him and he quickly glitched to avoid impact. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to stop the bookshelf. It slammed to the ground with a loud thud. And Mono knew they were in trouble. He unglitched and ran over to a small crate. He looked at the knight and signaled for it to come in with him, but the knight had a better idea. It leapt into one of the drawers, holding the files, and crouched down, hiding its horns. As the door to the room opened, Mono looked away as he heard the disgusting sound of the teacher's neck stretching out, looking for whatever caused the noise. Mono waited for a while longer and soon he heard the teacher's footsteps, leaving the room. He quietly got out of his hiding place and looked around for his friend. The knight peeked its head out of the drawer and then got out. Mono walked out a small hole in the wall and the knight followed closely behind. Mono kept his eyes on the teacher as they walked around the classroom, observing the bullies as they worked. Whenever she moved, Mono and the knight were still, hiding from her vision, and moved when she was not looking. Eventually, they both made it out of the classroom and ran as far away as they could. They came to an elevator and Mono inserted the key, opening the elevator doors. The two stepped inside and the elevator doors closed. They waited in the elevator until the doors opened back up and they walked out. Mono looked around and saw the shadows of several bullies. He pulled out his ladle and slowly advanced towards the chaos. The knight followed behind with its nail drawn, ready to fight. Mono walked around the corner and saw several bullies beating each other up, stuffing jellyfish and infection bubbles inside their heads, and all of them were laughing as they did it. One of the bullies looked at Mono and the knight and screamed out. The others looked towards them and every bully charged at Mono and the knight. Mono glitched away from them, then counterattacked from behind, crushing some of the bullies' head with his ladle. The knight leapt up to the sky and slammed down with a burst of black energy, sending all bullies around it flying into the walls, breaking their heads. The bullies who had infection in their heads got back up and started frantically chasing after Mono and the knight. Mono glitched, not wanting to face the explosion of the infection, and one of the bullies ran into the wall behind him, exploding on contact. Mono got an idea and lead another bully to the knight. The knight also had a bully chasing them, and the two of them jumped out of the way as the bullies' heads collided, causing a massive explosion. Mono and the knight got to their feet and looked around at the sea of broken heads and headless bodies. Mono took a few deep breaths and then continued forwards with the knight by his side. They came to a room with jars stacked on shelves. In each jar was something that belonged in Fog Canyon. There were bunches of small jellyfish, bubbles of infection, and bundles of electric butterflies, all stacked up on the shelves. Suddenly, even more bullies came through the door, their arms reaching out for the two of them. Mono quickly defended himself with his ladle, defeating the bullies before they could reach him. Once there were too many to handle, he jumped onto one of the shelves and an idea popped into his head. He grabbed a jar full of electric butterflies and threw it down at the bullies. The jar cracked open and the butterflies flew out, shocking the bullies. Mono grabbed another jar, this one holding a bubble of explosive infection, and threw it down at the bullies. The knight, catching on to Mono's plan, dashed away from the jar and it exploded on contact with the heart of bullies. Mono thought they were done, but he was so wrong. He looked out the door and saw the shadow of the teacher walking towards them. With no time to hide, Mono and the knight were seen by the teacher as she walked into the room, looking for what was causing the noise. Upon seeing the two of them, she screamed out and her neck reached for both of them. Thinking fast, Mono threw a jar full of butterflies at the teacher's face and she got caught in the angry swarm of electric bugs. "Run!" Mono yelled and he and the knight started booking it down the halls. "Come back here," the teacher yelled. "You two have been very naughty children." Mono and the knight didn't stop running. The teacher's neck stretched out, chasing after them as they ran through the classrooms and halls. Suddenly, they came to an area with several jellyfish floating around. The knight leapt up to one of the big jellyfish and struck it with their nail, sending the orange core of the jellyfish right to the teacher's face. She screamed out as her neck retracted to her body and Mono and the knight kept running until they came to a vent. They got inside and crawled through the vent into another room. After a while of crawling, they came to the end of the vent and hopped out into another room. They looked around and Mono just felt stupid. They had entered the lunchroom at the wrong time. PH1CH14. Welcome to your combat lesson. The knight looked over the sea of bullies in the cafeteria. They had ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time for sure. All of the bullies turned their heads towards the knight and Mono, and before anyone could scream, they all ran towards them. The knight jumped up and struck the heads of the bullies with its nail, pogoing across the room. Mono glitched himself and started running through the bullies as their hands fell right through him. The knight eventually struck the head of an infected bully and its out shell was exposed. Luckily, there were so many other bullies around that the head of the infected bully almost instantly exploded once it was exposed. The knight eventually saw a boarded up door with a hole near the top of it. The knight dashed through the hole and found itself in a room with drawers and shelves filled with bottles of some sort. It looked around for its friend and saw them fall through the boards and unglitch. The knight looked through the other side of the door and saw that all the bullies had luckily lost interest in them and were continuing to bully each other. It then leapt down to the floor to make sure its friend was alright. "My head hurts," Mono groaned as the knight helped him up to his feet. Once its friend was back on his feet, the knight looked around for a way to escape and spotted a small puddle of acid near the floor of the room. It looked closer and found out that it wasn't just a puddle, it was a full stream underneath the floor. But that was only an escape route for it. The knight needed to find an escape route for Mono. The knight looked and saw a vent near the roof of the room. Unfortunately, it was sealed shut. An idea came to the knight and it motioned for Mono to stay in the room. "Why? Will you come back?" Mono asked, sitting down because of his head. The knight nodded and jumped into the acid. It swam underneath the floor of the teacher's archives and eventually found a small hole above it. It climbed out and ended up in some kind of hallway. It looked around and found an entrance to a vent, this time with the cover off. The knight leapt into the vent and started to crawl its way back to Mono. Once it reached the sealed end, it looked through to make sure its friend was still okay. The knight saw Mono sitting in the corner, keeping his eyes on the door, with his hand on his ladle. The knight struck the vent cover with its nail, trying to knock it off, and Mono looked towards it. The knight delivered a few more blows with its nail, and the vent cover fell off. It leaned out of the vent and reached its hand down for Mono. Mono got to his feet and jumped up to the knight's hand, grabbing it. The knight pulled Mono into the vent and they both crawled out of it. Once they were out, they walked down the hallway and found themselves in a large room filled with platforms and acid bubbling at the bottom. They jumped down the room, landing on the platforms, and soon they got to the acid pool at the bottom. Suddenly, a door opened up and the teacher walked through. She looked at the two of them and a creepy smile spread across her face. "Found you, you little troublemakers," she said, with her neck stretching up. "You two are going to be in detention for a long time." The knight drew its nail and Mono pulled out his ladle. The teacher's neck stretched towards them and they both leapt onto the upper platforms. Suddenly, the teacher's neck pulsed with electricity and large shock of plasma filled the room. The knight did its best to avoid the shock and leapt at the teacher, striking her with its nail. But to its surprise, the nail bounced off of her head like it was made of rubber. "Violence shall not be tolerated in my school," the teacher yelled. "You'll receive an extra punishment for this." The teacher's neck began pulsing with electricity as it extended towards the knight, her mouth chomping at it. The knight managed to get away and met up with Mono. "How do we beat her?" Mono asked. The knight looked around the room and something caught its eye. A large jellyfish was rising up from the acid underneath them, followed by many others. The knight looked at Mono and they both instantly understood the plan. They leapt away from the platform they were standing on and started moving to the jellyfish. The teacher's mouth snapped at the knight as her neck extended further and further. But the knight managed to get to a jellyfish and struck it with their nail, sending the orange core right into the teacher's face. The core exploded and the teacher screamed as the electricity faded from her neck. Mono leapt down and struck the teacher's head with his ladle. The knight followed with several swift strikes from its nail, with bursts of orange infection coming from the teacher's wounds. Electricity started to surge through the teacher's neck again and the knight and Mono leapt away. "Come back here, you naughty children," the teacher screamed as her neck stretched towards the two of them. They reached another jellyfish and Mono turned towards the teacher. "Hey. What's x2?" he yelled out. "Well, at least you've done your math," the teacher said. "The answers." 4. Mono yelled as he swung his ladle like a golf club. His ladle struck the jellyfish and its core flew into the teacher's face, exploding again. Mono and the knight leapt down at the teacher and started wailing on her with everything they had. Suddenly, the teacher screamed as a large burst of infection erupted from her head. Large amounts of infection poured out from her and with a final explosion, she fell into the acid. Mono jumped up and down, happy because of their victory, but the knight still some had unfinished business in here. Mono and the knight walked through the door and there was a pool of acid underneath them. The knight motioned to Mono to wait and it dove into the pool of acid. After swimming down a tunnel for a while, it came to a large room with a tank of acid. The knight climbed up to the top of the room and saw the glitched figure of its friend once again. The glitched figure removed its mask and it shinned into the tank, revealing Monomon, the teacher. The figure faded away and the knight struck Monomon with the dream nail. It arrived in the dream realm, face to face with her. The knight slashed at Monomon with its nail until she was weak enough for them to absorb. The knight began to focus as Monomon's energy was pulled into them. At the temple of the Black Egg, Monomon's mask disappeared and another radiant scream echoed from inside. The H1CH15. The Old Stag. Mono waited for his friend by the acid pool. They were going to come back, he knew they were. They had come back for him last time, so surely they would come back this time. He waited and then he saw his friend swimming back through the acid. "Did you do what you needed to?" Mono asked the knight as it got out of the acid. The knight nodded. "Good, then let's go," Mono said and the two of them walked out of the teacher's archives. They walked back through Fog Canyon and had to avoid a few more obstacles. They came to a large hole in the ground with jellyfish and electric butterflies floating around. The knight led Mono down the hole and together they made their way down, avoiding the jellyfish and the butterflies. After a while of climbing down, they arrived at the bottom of the hole, and right in front of them was a tunnel that was coated with silver walls. Mono followed the knight into the room, and he saw that the room was a lot larger than he thought. There were several doorways leading to different rooms, and there were platforms all around so that you could get to them. Mono followed the knight to a room with a sign that had a symbol in the shape of a stag. Mono walked into the room, and he saw a bench in front of a long tunnel. He sat down, letting the soul particles sink into him and heal his wounds. In front of the bench, there was a bell, which the knight struck with its nail. Suddenly, Mono felt the ground rumbling and heard a sound coming from tunnel, as if something massive was coming their way. What's going on? Mono asked, slightly afraid. He inched towards the tunnel, and suddenly a humongous stag ran up through the tunnel. The stag stopped right in front of Mono and the knight and then looked towards them. "Well, hello there, my little friend," the stag said with an old, scratchy voice. "It's very nice to see you again." The knight nodded and the stag looked at Mono. "Who might you be?" it asked. My name is Mono," he said, not knowing anything else to say. "Are you traveling with the little one?" the stag asked. "Yes, I am," Mono replied. "Who are you?" "I am the Old Stag," the stag replied. "For a long time, stags like myself roamed these stations, carrying passengers throughout the kingdom. But when the infection came, many people stopped using the stag stations, and my kind started to die. For a long time, I considered myself to be the last stag in this vast kingdom, but after finding my home, I had hope that others had escaped this kingdom and went to live elsewhere." "Wow, that's pretty neat," Mono said. "Yes, but never mind that, where would you like to go?" the stag said, turning towards the knight. The knight looked at a board and pointed to a place titled Dirtmouth. The stag sighed. "I almost forgot to tell you, my little friend," they said. "Something has happened and many of these tunnels have closed off, giving me only a few places to take you. I'm sorry, but the place you want to go has been closed off with several bubbles of that orange infection. I don't dare to go near it for fear I may lose myself," the stag said. "Well, where can you take us?" Mono asked. "Alas, I can only take you as far as the king's station and nowhere else," the old stag sighed. "Well, how about we go there?" Mono said, looking at the knight. The knight shrugged and started to get onto one of the seats the old stag had on his back. Mono followed the knight and took a seat on the chair behind the knight. "Have you ridden a stag before, young one?" the old stag asked, leaning its head towards Mono. "No, I don't think I have," he replied. "Then hold on tight," said the old stag, and it started to run. As the stag galloped up and down, Mono held onto his seat as he bounced up and down on the stag. They ran through the tunnels, and Mono felt slightly afraid that he might fall off. Despite the old stag's age, it could run pretty fast. The stag carried them through the tunnel and they came to another station. But this one didn't have a roof over it and it was pouring down with rain. As Mono got off the stag's back, he felt slightly nauseous and stumbled his way to the bench. "Be careful around here," the old stag said. "This city has changed, became more menacing." The knight hopped off of the stag's back and walked over to Mono, who was trying to stop his head from spinning. Mono sat still and focused on the wall in front of him, staring at it while his head moved. Eventually, his nausea faded and he was perfectly okay. He got off the bench and he and the knight walked into another room that was about just as big as the last one. The floors were soaking wet and the walls were polished with a dark blue paint on them. Mono looked around and saw that all the tunnels were blocked with several large boulders. The knight jumped down into the water below them and Mono followed. They both got out and found themselves in another tunnel, which looked like it was previously another stag station. The tunnel where the stag would have come was flooded with water, the sign and bell were destroyed, and the bench looked like it had been sawed in half. Mono looked back at the knight and it jumped into the flooded tunnel, swimming underneath the rocks above it. Mono jumped in as well and swam after his friend. They arrived in a tunnel that didn't look anything like the station they had entered through and there was a bunch of rubble all around them. Mono followed the knight to a large opening in the roof of the tunnel, with light pouring out of it. The knight leapt onto the walls of the tunnel and climbed into the hole. Mono grabbed the rigid edges of the rocks and followed the knight into the hole. Once he got there, he saw that this hole had walls, padded with mattress-like material. He was in a small room, with two doors leading to the left and right. The knight walked through one of the doors, and Mono followed. They both climbed up platforms to reach the top of the room, with nothing but padded walls and a padded door with a keyhole. Mono remembered the soft padded keyhole he found back in the Queen's Gardens and pulled it out. He slipped the key into the lock and the door opened. Mono and the knight walked through, unaware of the deep black creature lurking above them, watching them as they walked into the tower. The H1CH16. The Tower of Love. The knight walked through the door and into the tower. It hadn't been able to unlock that door for a long time, but thanks to Mono, now it could. although it felt like something was off. It walked through the tower with Mono, and they found a room filled with several jars. Why would someone need so many jars? Mono asked. The knight shrugged and looked around. The walls were very padded, but there was no door to another room. It looked to a large shelf that had sorted jars, each one with a living bug inside. Next to the shelf was a pulley system that looked like it was used to move the jars up to the shelves. The knight looked closer and saw that there were some jars missing. Upon closer inspection, it saw that each place where a jar was missing had a symbol of a bug in it. It looked at the bugs on the shelf and started to identify them. There was an aspid, a crawlid, and a vengefly. It looked at the stack of jars on the floor and saw that there were bugs inside those as well. The jars held a squid, a gruzzer, a moss creep, and an obel. The knight looked back at the symbols on the shelf and they matched perfectly. What do we do? Mono asked. There's no door out of here. The knight hopped down and started to move the jar that contained the squid. Mono started to push with him and together they managed to push the jar onto the platform. The knight pointed to the lever and Mono caught onto the plan. He started to turn the lever, elevating the knight to one of the upper shelves. Mono looked up and the knight held its hand out to try and say, "Stop." Mono stopped turning the handle and the knight pushed the jar into its correct place. It did the same with the other jars and soon the shelf was complete. Once filled, the shelf began to move over, revealing a hallway. The knight walked through the hallway and Mono followed close behind. They walked into a room with even more jars, containing even more bugs. However, this time, some of the bugs were dead. Mono and the knight continued walking and arrived at the front of a sealed door with a small window at the top of it. The knight could easily use the mantis claw or the monarch wings to get through the door, but Mono couldn't. It looked around for something it could use to help its friend get through the window and then saw a jar flipped over, without a lid. The knight began to push the jar towards the door and Mono came over to help. Once the jar was at the foot of the door, Mono jumped on top of it and climbed out the window and the door. The knight followed and the two of them pressed forwards. As they walked through the tower, the knight began to hear something. It sounded like a giggle. Not only that, but a series of joyful, playful giggles. The voice making them sounded like some sort of clown or joker and it sounded like it was playing with something. As the knight walked further, it heard the sound of a grub. The grub sounded happy and playful, like it was playing with whoever was making the giggling sounds. Suddenly, it recognized the jars. Those were the same jars that the grubs were imprisoned in all throughout Hellenist. This person wasn't playing with the grubs, they were tricking them into being captured and contained inside these jars. Realizing the truth, the knight felt the need to save the grub from this person's grasp. Suddenly, a jar fell down from the ceiling, almost landing on top on Mono. It broke as it hit the floor and an aspid escaped and started attacking them. Mono quickly slammed his ladle onto the aspid, destroying it before it could hurt them. "These bugs are infected," he said. "Maybe whoever's containing them is good. Maybe they're trying to contain the infection." The knight shook its head. If this person was trying to contain the infection, then why would they be trapping the grubs? It didn't make any sense. "Well, we don't know yet, but hopefully we don't met whoever this person is," Mono said. The knight had to disagree. It wanted to meet this creature so that it could defeat it and save the grubs that were trapped in here. As they walked along, they came to another locked door. The knight looked around and saw a glitched ladder. Mono saw that ladder as well and walked towards it. "Don't worry, I'll be back soon," he said, looking at the knight with a reassuring gaze. The knight nodded and sat down as Mono glitched himself and climbed the ladder. As the knight waited for its friend to come back down, it heard the giggles again. Except this time they sounded close. Very close. The knight pulled out its nail, ready to face the mysterious foe. It looked around and heard footsteps from the roof above them. The knight became worried about Mono, afraid that the creature was headed after him. Suddenly, something fell through the roof behind them and it was grabbed by 4 hands and knocked unconscious. When the knight awoke, they were in a jar and they were without their nail. They looked around and saw that someone was carrying the jar and they were skipping and hopping along as they did so. The figure came to a shelf and placed the knight's jar on top of it. The knight looked at its kidnapper and saw they were a deep black bug with 4 arms and 2 wide eyes. The figure looked back at the knight and giggled. "Don't worry," it said. "You are safe now. You can stay here, inside this safe sanctuary for all," it happily said. The knight placed its hands on the jar, trying to find a way out. However, its attempt was meaningless. The black bug stepped away from the shelf and turned to the knight. "Now you stay here and don't move," it said. "I'm going to come back with your friend and then you can both be safe in here forever." The bug turned away from the knight and started skipping away, playfully singing to itself. "A special place where you can stay. Safe from everything, every day," it sung as it skipped through a door. The knight desperately looked for a way out. If only it had its nail, it could break through the jar, but it was left behind. The knight could only pray that Mono was able to defend himself against this creature. VH1CH17. The Collector. Mono climbed up the glitched ladder for a lot longer than he expected. The ladder went so high up that he needed to grab onto the padded walls in order to stop the constantly growing pain in his head every time he glitched. Eventually, he made it to the top of the ladder and found a large lever. Mono tried to pull the lever, but it was stuck in place and he couldn't do anything about it. He thought for a moment about the ways he could possibly pull the lever and then he swung his ladle against it. That did the trick, as the lever was jerked to the other side due to the ladle striking it. Mono heard a loud sound from underneath him that sounded like a door opening. Mono climbed back down the ladder, making sure to grab onto the walls when his head started to hurt too much. He arrived at the bottom of the ladder and was shocked out of his mind. The night snail was lying on the ground and the knight himself was nowhere to be seen. Mono's mind began to pace as he tried to think about what could have happened to his friend. Okay, I don't think they left me, because even if they did, they wouldn't leave their nail behind. Mono thought. Were they killed? No, that wouldn't make any sense. Suddenly, the answer clicked in his mind. They were captured. He thought. He picked up the knight's nail and hung it around his coat. It would need this once he found them. He looked to his side and saw that the door was now wide open and without hesitation, he walked through. Behind the door was nothing but a room filled with empty jars and nothing else. Mono looked for a way forward and spotted a vent close by. He climbed on top of the jars and crawled through the vent. As he crawled, he heard several laughs and giggles coming from above him, followed by the sound of someone skipping on the floor above him. Mono followed the sounds, thinking that maybe whoever was making these noises was the one that captured the knight. He crawled through the vent for a long time, but he soon came to a hole in the vent. Mono looked out of the hole and just stared at the room in front of him. Inside the room was a large black bug with 4 arms and a weirdly shaped head. But it wasn't the bug that Mono was staring at, it was what the bug was holding. In its 2 left hands, it held a jar with the knight stuck inside. The bug placed the jar on a shelf and Mono watched as his friend desperately tried to escape. Mono needed to find a way to get into that room. He continued to crawl through the vent and he came to a long drop. He looked for another way, but that drop was the only way out. Thinking fast, Mono leapt down the vent and fell for a long time. Once he saw the floor of the vent getting too close, he glitched himself and landed on the floor without any pain. Just like he planned. Mono unglitched and crawled to the exit right in front of him. Once he got out of the vent, he stretched his back. It hurt from being crouched over in the vent for so long. After he was done stretching, he continued forward. He had fallen a long way down into the tower and he needed to find a way back up. Something like an elevator or staircase would do. As he wandered through the rooms of the tower, he saw black tentacles, just like the ones he saw in the Queen's Gardens, rising up from the floor of this room. He walked around, searching for a way up, and then found a large room with stairs spiraling upwards. Perfect. He thought, and he began to climb the stairs. As he climbed, he heard the giggling of the bug that had captured his friend. He looked around and suddenly saw the bug looking down at him. Mono shrieked as the bug leapt down closer to him. "Do not be afraid," the bug said in a playful voice. "I have your friend. You can both stay here and be safe from everything forever." Mono didn't trust this thing. Whatever it was, it captured his friend and he was not going to let it capture him. Mono drew his ladle and continued to advance up the stairs. "Not listening, are you?" the bug asked. "Well then, the collector's going to have to do this the hard way." Then it chuckled as it leapt up to a higher ledge on the wall. Mono started to run up the stairs, trying to avoid this foe as best he could. The collector jumped down with 2 jars in its hands, each one containing a hostile bug. They threw the jars at Mono and they broke open once they hit the stairs. Mono leapt at the hostile bugs, now free from their cages, and smashed his ladle on top of them. He continued to run up the stairs, but the collector wasn't making anything easy. It kept throwing jars at Mono and increased the number of them as well. Mono slammed his ladle onto any bugs that came near him and started sprinting up the stairs. He was getting very tired and worn out, but nothing was going to keep him from getting to his friend. He kept climbing and suddenly, the collector jumped behind him, its arms ready to snatch him. Mono quickly glitched, avoiding the collector's clutches, and then proceeded to thrust his ladle into its face. The collector leapt back up to the ledges and continued to throw even more jars at Mono. After it had thrown a few of them, it would jump down and try to grab Mono with all 4 of its hands. Mono, however, was beginning to predict the collector's pattern and was able to escape its grabs and land a hit on them. After a long period of running, avoiding jars, attacking bugs, glitching, and striking the collector, Mono eventually made it to the top of the staircase. He arrived in an open room where the collector skipped around him, leaping at him with its hands out every once in a while. Mono was so tired to the collector by now and he fought ferociously against them. When the collector jumped at Mono again, he struck them with his ladle, and the collector's arms melted off, and the rest of its body began to drip. Mono struck the collector with his ladle several times, and it suddenly burst into small black particles. Ahahahaha. Wihuhuhahaha. The collector laughed out as the particles burst from its body. Once it had finished laughing, it fell to the floor, and its body turned to liquid. "Serves you right," Mono said to the collector's puddle of black substance. Mono continued walking and found a room filled with jars. Inside each jar was a caterpillar-looking bug, all of them hanging their heads in despair. As Mono walked into the room, a bunch of the caterpillars looked up at him, their stubby little legs poking at the glass walls of their jars and making cute noises with their mouths. It was as if they were begging Mono to release them. Mono didn't know if he could trust them, but their cries were just so painful to listen to. He struck one of the jars with his ladle, breaking it. The caterpillar jumped up and down with joy and then dug into the ground. Mono looked at the several other jars in the room. "This is gonna take ma a while," he thought. Suddenly, as he was looking, he saw a familiar face looking at him. It was the face of the knight. Mono rushed over to his friend and broke them out of their jar. Once they were out, he fell onto his friend, hugging them. He didn't want to lose them again. PH1CH18. Hospital. The knight sat still as Mono hugged them. Had he been that afraid? What could have happened to him while it was gone and trapped inside its jar? In an attempt to comfort Mono, the knight hugged back. Although his bag protected his face, the knight could tell Mono was crying behind the shelter of the bag. Mono finally let go and pulled out the knight's nail. "I noticed you lost this," he said, and he reached the nail out to the knight. The knight took its nail and then looked at the several grubs trapped inside glass jars. One by one, the knight and Mono broke the jars open and the grubs burrowed underground to their home. Once that was done, they looked for a way out of this tower. The knight spotted an open window with a rope leading to another building. The knight led Mono to the window and they climbed out and into the window at the end of the rope. Once they got inside, however, the floor underneath them broke open and they fell down several floors. The knight braced itself for the impact, but surprisingly, they landed on a soft surface. It looked to see what had cushioned its fall and saw it landed on a plushie of some sort. The knight got to its feet and looked around. They were in some kind of playroom with toys and drawings and plushies. While this seemed nice to the knight, it could tell Mono did not think that way. Mono had landed safely, but he was frantically looking around the room in fear. He looked at a bunny plushie and started tugging at the bunny's ear. The knight decided to help its friend and cut the ear off with its nail. A spark came from the ear as if the knight had hit something made of metal. Surprisingly, it did. Mono pulled out a key from the bunny's ripped ear and started running out of the room. The knight followed Mono, confused to why he was running. Why did this place scare him? Why did he want to get out of it so badly? Mono ran into a larger room with figures sitting on wheelchairs and chairs. The knight looked closer at the figures and realized that they were mannequins. The strangest part was that they were missing their heads and they looked eerie, almost as if they were alive. The knight's observing came to a halt once it heard Mono call down to it. The knight ran up a flight of stairs and met Mono at the top, in front of an unlocked door, most likely the door the key was for. Mono grabbed the knight's hand and pulled them along with him. The knight was confused. Why was Mono acting like this? Had he encountered the collector and barely survived? Had he been so afraid to be alone and without a friend at his side? The knight couldn't tell why Mono was acting so strange and it didn't have a way to ask why, so instead it walked along with Mono, holding his hand to try and comfort him like it usually did. The knight walked with Mono into a room filled with mannequin limbs. They were hanging from the roof, stuffed into drawers and placed on several shelves. They came to a door with a small opening at the top. Mono looked at the knight and it understood. It got in front of the door and held out its hands to boost Mono up. Once Mono was boosted through the door, the knight leapt through themselves using the monarch wings. Mono grabbed the knight's hand again and began to lead it through the room they were now in. While they were walking, the knight couldn't help but realize the figure atop a hospital bed right next to them. The figure looked like an incomplete mannequin, but its hand it looked alive. Suddenly, the hand ripped free from the body of the mannequin and scurried around the room before crawling under some boxes. The knight suddenly felt Mono's hand jerk forward, pulling them along with him. Mono ran through the room with the hand crawling in the mannequin parts near them. Suddenly, the hand crawled out of the parts and leapt at the knight. The knight was prepared to fight back but was instantly pulled behind Mono. Mono pulled out his ladle and once the hand crawled back, he slammed his weapon on the hand with full force. The hand scurried away and looped around for more. The knight readied itself to fight, but Mono kept them behind him as he fought off the hand. The knight was more concerned than ever. Why was Mono not letting it fight? Mono clearly knew that it was perfectly capable of defending itself, so why was he not letting it fight? Mono crushed the hand and pulled the knight along. They crawled up through a vent and ran through a series of rooms. As they ran through the rooms, the knight's concern for Mono only grew. He was clutching its hand tightly, as if they were afraid to let go, and he was shining his flashlight everywhere, as if looking for something that could possibly jump out at them. They came to a room with a battery of some kind, and Mono finally let go of the knight's hand. He grabbed the battery and started to jog back through a door with a broken bottom. The knight followed its friend and they walked back into the main room. The knight followed Mono to a cage door with a slot that seemed like it would match the battery. Mono slipped the battery in and the door opened. Mono walked through, but before the knight could follow, Mono held his hand out, stopping the knight. The knight looked at Mono, confused more than ever. "I'm sorry, I can't let you come with me," Mono said. The knight tilted its head. Was he seriously thinking about going alone? "I'm sorry, but that place is dangerous. I've been here before and I can't have you coming with me into this room," Mono said. The knight thought that was absolutely absurd. If it was dangerous, then Mono could be killed. The knight could protect him, it had faced bigger things before. Determined to help its friend, it pushed forward against Mono's hand. "Stop. I told you, you can't come," Mono yelled. The knight only pushed harder against Mono's hand. "I said stop. Please just stay here," Mono yelled. The knight ignored Mono's yell and continued to push. "Please. I can't lose you again," Mono yelled, his voice scratching as if tears were sprinting down his face. The knight stopped and looked at Mono. "When I found your nail, I thought you were gone. I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose another friend," Mono yelled and tears escaped from the bottom of his paper bag. The knight backed away and grabbed onto Mono's hand. It knew what it was like to lose a friend and that was why it had to come with him. Mono looked at the knight as it held his hand and then looked to the floor. "I'm sorry, I just don't want to be alone forever," he said, tears dripping through the eye holes of his mask. The knight walked closer and looked at Mono with a reassuring gaze. Mono looked back and moved his hand under his bag to wipe the tears. "Alright, you can come with me," he said. "But please don't get killed." The knight pulled out its nail, held it across its chest, and nodded. Mono nodded back and they walked through the door, together. BH1CH19. The patience. As he walked through the door, Mono couldn't help but worry. He knew how dangerous the patients were and he didn't want to lose his friend again. He tried calming himself by remembering that the knight was able to defend itself and that it could no doubt handle the patients. However, even with that thought, he was still scared. Scared to lose his friend. The last time he had felt like this was with Six and he already lost her. He did not want to lose another friend, not in a place like this. Mono and the knight walked through the dark halls of the hospital and Mono made sure to keep his light on at all times. As the two of them ventured through the hospital, they came to a room with dim light and a singular mannequin standing up. Mono knew this trick. He pulled the lever on the side of the room and the light from above began to flicker. In every dark spot, the mannequin would slowly inch closer to the two of them. Once the light was completely out, the mannequin started to advance towards them. Mono shined his light onto the body of the mannequin and it froze like solid ice. Mono kept his flashlight on the mannequin and he and the knight slowly walked around and through a slightly open door on the opposite side of the room. Once out, the mannequin tried to chase them but couldn't fit through the metal door. Mono continued forward, leading the knight along through several pitch-black halls filled with patients. Mono and the knight walked through a cracked opening in the wall and came to a very large room which absolutely terrified Mono. He knew this room. This room was filled with patients, each one standing perfectly still, as if they were waiting for the perfect chance to attack. "Stay close to me," Mono whispered to the knight. The knight nodded and with a heavy breath, Mono began forward through the room. In a matter of seconds, a patient began to move towards them, followed by another. Mono shined his light at the patients and moved backwards. Whenever he heard the terrifying sound of the plastic limbs moving towards them, he would shine his light in that direction. So far things had been going smoothly, but the amount of patients was increasing by the minute and Mono didn't know how much longer he could keep this up. Luckily, they came close to a door with an open window near the top of it. Mono switched off his light and he and the knight jumped through the door, barely avoiding the grabby hands of the patients. Mono was already shook. He didn't want to stay here, but they needed the second battery for the elevator to work. Mono grabbed the hand of the knight and then started walking through a hallway with its walls covered in drawers. Suddenly, the drawers burst open as several mannequin hands reached for the two of them. Keeping a strong grasp on the knight's hand, Mono started sprinting through the hall, ducking and dodging the hands of the patients. Suddenly, he felt his hand get pulled backwards. He looked and saw that one of the hands had grabbed onto the knight. "Let them go," Mono yelled and started pulling his friend's hand, trying to get them free. The knight pulled out its nail and broke the hand of the mannequin off, freeing it. The two of them continued to run down the hall, and once they got to a corner, a door burst open with patients crawling after them. Mono shone his light at the hostile patients and ran down the hall ahead of them. As they ran, several other doors burst open, with even more patients trying to grab them. As they ran, they got to the end of the hall and climbed up a set of drawers and into a nearby vent. Once they got to the other side, Mono took deep, heavy breaths. "See why I didn't want you coming here with me?" Mono asked the knight. The knight nodded. After a few more breaths, Mono began to press forwards again, and he arrived in front of a patient sitting on a wheelchair. But this mannequin was different. It had bubbles of infection, swarming all over its body and dripping down from their head. Mono moved to turn the light off, remembering what he did last time, but the patient suddenly sprung to life. Panicked, Mono ran to the end of the room and got out his ladle to fight back. The knight was already attacking, and it broke off the patient's arm with its nail. But the arm started crawling on its own, as if the infection was keeping it alive. Mono rushed in to protect his friend, crushing the arm with his ladle. The knight leapt at the patient again, breaking off its other arm, and Mono made sure to finish it off. The knight broke of the rest of the patient's limbs and it fell to the floor, unable to move. Relived, Mono and the knight continued ahead and arrived in another pitch-black room, filled with patients. Mono didn't want to waste any time, he grabbed the knight's hand and started running through the room. The patients noticed the two individuals running through the room and started to advance towards them. Mono ran as fast as he could, shining his light at the patients in front of them and not worrying about the ones in the back. Suddenly he tripped and his flashlight dropped out of his hands, rolling away. No. Mono thought as he tried to reach for his light. The patients continued advancing at the two, and without his light to protect them, Mono closed his eyes and braced himself for the inevitable. Suddenly, he heard a piercing shriek from right next to him, followed by the sound of multiple pieces of plastic falling to the ground. Mono looked and saw the knight using its strange black magic to fight the patients. Mono took the chance and started scrambling for his light. He caught up to it and flashed it at the patients. Seeing they were now frozen, the knight ran over to Mono and the two ran through a boarded-up doorway. Mono looked around the room and saw a battery inside a slot, powering a machine of some sort. He tried to think of a way to get the battery out, then looked towards a lever on the wall of the room. He made his way over to the lever and climbed up a stool to reach it. He pulled the lever and the machine fired on, sparks flying everywhere. Once it was done, the battery popped out of the slot and Mono grabbed it. The two of them continued forward and finally arrived at the exit. The knight jumped through a slot in the door and Mono tossed the battery up to them. The knight slipped the battery into a slot and the door opened. Finally, Mono said, exhausted. "I never want to do that again." The knight looked at Mono with a strange stare. Although it couldn't speak, Mono knew what it was going to say. "Alright, it wasn't a mistake to bring you with me," he said. The knight nodded and the two walked out of the room. As they walked, Mono realized he didn't have to protect his new friend. They weren't fragile like Six, they weren't defenseless like Six, but most importantly they weren't Six. His new friend was perfectly capable of not only defending itself, but also Mono, and he was grateful for that. But despite that, he still missed Six. He hadn't forgot about her, and wherever she was, Mono wanted to find her and be friends again. The knight and Mono walked over to the elevator and slipped in the two batteries. They walked inside, and knowing very well what awaited them at the end of the elevator, Mono was determined to get himself and the knight out of here alive. BH1CH20. The doctor. Once at the end of the elevator, Mono walked out, prepared for what was coming next. He looked back at the knight and saw they were following him closely from behind. Mono flicked on his flashlight and began walking forward. He entered a room filled with mannequin parts like most of the other rooms, and suddenly, a hand crawled out from the drawers. Almost immediately after it emerged, another hand crawled out from a larger drawer. Mono pulled out his ladle, and once the hand leapt for him, he smashed to the ground. The knight drew its nail and began swiping at the second hand. Mono waited for the first hand to come back, and once it leaned, he crushed it with his ladle, with a burst of orange goo. He looked over and saw that the knight had defeated the other hand. Mono tucked his ladle away and pulled out his flashlight. As he and the knight walked further, he noticed a large orange glow in the distance. He entered a room filled with shelves, each one holding mannequin parts, and instantly knew what the glow was. He flicked off his flashlight and crouched down. He looked back at the knight and motioned for it to do the same. The knight nodded and they both crawled under a shelf, and Mono looked up at the figure above them, the doctor. The doctor had certainly changed since last time Mono faced him. He was covered in bubbles of infection, his eyes looked dead and had a strange orange glow, and drips of the infection leaked from his open mouth. In a situation like this, Mono would be shaking underneath his bag, but for some reason he wasn't. He was feeling something he hadn't felt since he had faced the Thin Man. Bravery. Once the doctor moved to another shelf, Mono slowly crawled under the shelf, guiding the knight with him. They wandered through the rooms and watched the doctor as he crawled on the ceiling above, checking the patients. Mono looked over to a locked cage door and looked for a way to activate it. He saw a button wired to the door and knew what to do. He threw his ladle at the button and then grabbed it once it fell to the ground. The door opened with a loud beep, catching the doctor's attention. Mono grabbed the knight's hand and ran underneath a nearby bed. He looked up at the doctor as he crawled around above them, searching for them. Once the doctor left the room, Mono guided the knight to some drawers, leading to a vent. He and the knight climbed up and entered the vent. The two of them tiptoed across the roof tiles beneath them, avoiding the open spots to not get seen by the doctor. Soon, they came to a room and Mono stared in shock. The room was filled with jars, holding orange infection. Mono and the knight continued forward, but they ran into the doctor. Mono hid behind a wall and peeked through the doorway to see what was going on. He watched as the doctor took a syringe, filled it with infection, and then injected it into one of the patients. So that's how that patient became infected. Mono thought. He waited for the doctor to move to the next patient and then scurried across the room, pulling the knight along with him. He hid behind a crate and he and the knight peeked at the doctor. Mono looked at the room and noticed a fuse in one of the shelves. Mono looked back at the room they came from and saw a door with a keyhole for the fuse. How do we distract him? Mono thought. He wandered into another room and saw a figure on a hospital bed, breathing as a heartbeat scale beeped. Mono looked at the switch wired to the machine and a plan began to formulate inside his head. "Boost me up," he whispered to the knight. The knight nodded and got underneath the switch, holding its hands out. Mono jumped onto them and the knight boosted it up onto the switch. Once Mono grabbed the switch, it pulled down and the figure started to shake violently as the heartbeat scale moved to a straight line. Mono pulled the knight under the bed as the doctor came rushing in to check on the patient. He pulled the switch and began to fix up the patient. As he did that, Mono and the knight snuck out of the room from underneath him and ran for the fuse. They got the fuse and scurried back to the door. Mono slipped the fuse into place and the door opened with another loud beep. As he heard the sound of the doctor crawling on the roof towards them, Mono started sprinting through the door and through the hallway it led to. The doctor followed them and knocked over a shelf of mannequin parts, causing Mono to trip. Before the doctor could grab him, he glitched himself and the doctor's hands went right through him. Confused, the doctor continued to swipe at him, trying to grab him. As he did, Mono looked for the knight as they were nowhere to be found. Mono wanted to search through the toppled shelves, but to do that he would have to unglitch, leaving him defenseless to the doctor. As he looked for his friend, the pain in his head grew worse and worse until he couldn't take it any longer and unglitched. The doctor snatched him up and crawled over to another room. Mono tried to fight back, but his head hurt too much to do so. The doctor strapped Mono onto a table and began to get his tools. It walked over, with ether and a syringe, ready to operate on him. Mono braced himself for the inevitable and suddenly, the doctor screamed out in pain. Mono looked and saw the knight leaping up and bursting the bubbles of infection on the doctor, avoiding his grasp. The doctor roared and spit orange infection everywhere. As the two fought, Mono struggled to break free. His headache was fading and he glitched himself once more. He quickly escaped the confines of the bed and unglitched himself before the pain could build. The doctor looked back and started chasing after Mono, but the knight let out another shriek and black and white energy shot up at the doctor. The doctor turned his attention towards the knight and just as he did, it struck him in the face, bursting the final bubble of infection on him. The doctor screamed as infection gushed out from his body and then fell to the ground like an empty sack. Mono took deep breaths and looked over at the doctor. "Good riddance," he said, with a vengeful tone. He hoped he would never have to see the doctor again. PH1CH21. The Pale City of Tears. The knight looked at the dead body of the doctor and then back to Mono. The knight walked over and looked at its friend, checking to see if they were okay. Mono turned to the knight and looked at it in the eye. "You came back to help me," he said. The knight nodded. Of course it came back. Mono was its friend after all. "We need to find a way out of here," Mono said, looking around the room. The knight and Mono wandered around the hospital for a little while, looking for a possible exit. They looked room after room and soon they found a cracked window leading outside. Good enough. The knight helped Mono through the window and they both landed on the stone floor outside. Rain sprinted down from the sky, landing on top of the knight's shell. They must have still been in the City of Tears. The knight walked through the caverns, leading Mono along with him, and soon they both came to an open area. The knight simply stared in disbelief. The buildings of the City of Tears were warping, bending toward something. Not only that, but there were other buildings, not like the ones in the City of Tears. Those buildings were bending as well. The knight looked at Mono, wondering if he knew what was going on. It watched as Mono gazed at the warped buildings all around them. He definitely knew something about this place. In the midst of all this confusion, the knight forgot about the injuries it gained from fighting the doctor. It needed to find a place to rest. There, it could heal up and maybe find out what was going on. The knight started walking forward and Mono followed. The knight looked over the city and saw loose clothing hanging everywhere, TVs active and inactive hanging as well, and orange vines and bubbles of infection crawling up the buildings. It couldn't believe what the city of tears had turned into. The knight continued to wander the city and finally, it found a bench surrounded by soul particles. The knight sat down and then looked up at the tower in front of them. The tower was straight unlike the others, it had an orange light buzzing on top of it, had chains surrounding the bottom of it, and all the other buildings seemed to be leaning towards it. The signal tower, Mono whispered. The knight looked at Mono in confusion. What was this signal tower? Mono looked at the knight and sat down next to it. That tower is the source of everything wrong here, Mono began to explain. It broadcasts a signal through the city, making anything and everything submit to its rule. That's why all these buildings are bending towards it. The knight nodded, processing everything Mono said. I'm just explaining that because you seemed confused, he clarified. The knight sat on the bench with Mono, looking at the signal tower. Looks like it's merged with the infection, Mono said. Maybe the two have combined, making these two cities into one. The knight looked at Mono. Sorry, I was just making a theory based off of what I was seeing, Mono said. The Pale City sure has fell from what it used to be. The Pale City? What was the Pale City? The knight wondered for a while. Could it be connected to the Pale King? No, this city was from Mono's world, not theirs, so it couldn't have any connection to the Pale King. What do you call this place? Mono asked while the knight was thinking. The knight pulled out its map and pointed to the section labeled the City of Tears. Mono looked at the map and then back at the knight. Perhaps this city needs a new name, with everything going on now, Mono said. The knight nodded, a new name would be suitable, seeing that the City of Tears had merged with this Pale City that Mono was talking about. How about the Pale City of Tears? Mono suggested. The knight stared at Mono for a little bit. Yeah, I know it sounds stupid, it was just the first thing that came to mind, Mono said. The knight didn't know anything better, so it turned the map around and began to make a map of every place they had been to so far. Once it got caught up, it labeled the section they were in, the Pale City of Tears. Mono looked at the map and then looked at the knight. You like it? He asked. The knight nodded. Thanks. Mono said, his voice sounding cheerier than usual. The two sat on the bench for a while, looking at the city. The knight then remembered that their work was not yet finished and got up from the bench. Mono got up with them and they both walked ahead through the city. The knight looked back at the bottom of the tower and saw the chains at the bottom of it. What were those chains for? They looked similar to the ones at the Temple of the Black Egg. Could the signal tower have possibly merged with the Black Egg just like the Pale City and the City of Tears merged? The knight didn't know. It only knew what it had to do. As it walked, it remembered its main mission. To defeat the Dreamers and break the seal, protecting the Temple of the Black Egg. Only one more dreamer remained. Lurian. Lurian resided in the City of Tears and luckily, the knight and Mono were in that area. The knight pressed forward, determined to put a stop to the infection and protect its friend more than ever. BH1CH22. The Nailsmith. The knight wandered through the city with Mono behind them and rain beating down on its shell. It needed to find the Watcher's Spire. There, it could defeat Lurian, and once the seal was broken, it could defeat the Hollow Knight. Surprisingly, there hadn't been anything hostile so far. That only put the knight on edge even more. If there was nothing, then something could be sneaking up on them. The knight continued guiding Mono, and the knight met the eyes of an infected husk sentry. The sentry gasped and advanced towards Mono and the knight. The knight didn't waste any time and started attacking the sentry with its nail. Mono joined in on the fight, attacking with his ladle. The knight delivered a final blow to the sentry's head and it fell to the ground with a burst of orange goo. Mono and the knight continued walking, only to be met with several more sentries, and not just of one class. There were heavy sentries, winged sentries, and land sentries coming from all around. Mono and the knight jumped back into battle as the sentries attacked with their nails. The knight leapt up to the winged sentries and land sentries, striking them with several blows. The land sentries threw their lances at the knight, but it was able to avoid them. The knight let out an abyss shriek and defeated every winged and land sentry. The knight landed on the ground and heard the cry of its friend. It whipped around to see all of the heavy sentries attacking Mono, and he was struggling. The knight leapt above some of the sentries and slammed down with descending dark, crushing them. Once they were down, the knight swiftly struck down the remaining husks, making sure they couldn't hurt Mono. After the battle had passed, the knight went over to Mono to see if he was okay. I'm fine, Mono grunted. "These guys are becoming a lot harder to deal with," he said, struggling to stand up straight. The knight couldn't help but worry for its friend. The signal tower must have enforced the infection, making everything a lot stronger, and Mono was fighting with nothing but a rusted soup ladle. Mono needed a better form of both offense and defense. Luckily for the knight, it had an idea. The knight guided Mono inside one of the buildings and it began to wander around, searching for the place it needed to go. It wandered around for a while and came to an elevator that was natural to the city. The knight stepped inside and once Mono got in as well, it struck the lever at the top of the elevator and they started moving down. They came to an open area with a sign bearing a nail symbol. That was where the knight needed to go. It walked in the direction of where the sign was pointing and came to a small cliff with a lit hut. The knight helped Mono climb up the cliff and they both walked into the hut to meet the person the knight was looking for. The Nailsmith. The knight walked up to the Nailsmith and he turned his head to meet the knight's. "Ah, hello little one," the Nailsmith said in an old scratchy voice. "How may I assist you this time?" he asked. "I must say, this city has changed. I can feel it, the voice that speaks to me in my dreams grows stronger. Do I obey it? No, it offers union, but my work is still unfinished," he said. "But enough about that, do you wish for a nail upgrade?" The knight walked over to Mono and pointed at him. "Your friend?" the Nailsmith asked. "Very well, lend me your nail." Actually, I don't use a nail," Mono said, a little nervous. "You don't?" the Nailsmith asked in confusion. "Then what do you use to defend yourself?" This," Mono said, pulling out his ladle. "A soup ladle?" the Nailsmith asked. "You fight with a puny, meager soup ladle? It's a miracle you haven't perished yet. Hey. I'll let you know I've cracked heads open with this ladle and I'll continue to do so with the same one," Mono yelled, feeling offended. "Alright then," the Nailsmith said. "After all, it is not only the strength of a weapon that makes it powerful, but the strength of the one who wields it as well. But I must say, at your weapon's current state, it would surely break. If I cannot stop you from using a ladle, then at least allow me to strengthen it," the Nailsmith said. "Alright, sure," Mono said, and he handed his ladle over to the Nailsmith. "One piece of pale ore should do the trick," the Nailsmith said, studying Mono's ladle. "Pale ore? What's pale ore?" Mono asked. The knight reached into its cloak and pulled out a silver-white stone, gleaming in the light from the fireplace. It had one other piece and planned to use both of them to upgrade its nail, but Mono needed it more. The infection was getting stronger and Mono needed a strong weapon. It walked over to the Nailsmith and he took the ore from the knight's hand. The Nailsmith got to work, breaking down the ore, melting it into liquid metal, scraping the rusted metal off of Mono's ladle, making a mold for it, melting the ladle down itself, combining it with the melted pale ore, and finally forging the ladle back together. "Here, it is done," he said, handing the ladle to Mono. "It should be much more durable and less heavy to wield." The knight watched as Mono swiftly swung the ladle around, giggling with how well it worked. "Thank you. This works perfectly," Mono said, delighted with his new weapon. "Glad it does," the Nailsmith said. "Come back anytime, I will always be here to upgrade your weapons." He got back to work and both Mono and the knight walked out of the forge. They climbed down the cliff and were met with another husk sentry. This time however, the knight stayed back as Mono fought the sentry instead. He defeated the sentry in just a couple blows and turned towards the knight with a delightful gaze. "This will come in handy," he said. The knight nodded. It would certainly have to be for where they were going next. PH1CH23. Soul Twisters. The knight remembered its way around the city. While there were a few other buildings and arrangements that were different, most of it remained very familiar. It needed to get to the Watcher's Spire and face the Watcher Knights in order to defeat Lurien. That's why Mono needed a better weapon. The knight remembered the Watcher Knights were brutal and if it and Mono were not prepared, they would surely perish. The knight made their way to the spire, but for some reason, the entrance was sealed off. The knight was confused. It was sure it had opened the seal to the spire, so why was it closed? Something must have changed, but the knight couldn't worry about that now. It knew another way into the spire, so it started heading off towards that. Mono followed the knight and the two worked together to get over hurdles, gates, and obstacles that were introduced to them. The knight made its way into one of the buildings and set off to the second entrance. However, it met a large cluster of boulders blocking the path. The knight peeked through a small hole and saw that the second entrance was still open. The problem was, the boulders were too heavy to move and there wasn't a quick way around. With that, there was only one other way to get to the Watcher's Spire. They had to go through the Soul Sanctum. "Are you trying to go somewhere?" Mono asked the knight. "We've been running into sealed doors and blocked hallways, so is there somewhere we need to get to?" The knight nodded and motioned for Mono to follow them. They made their way up the building, defeating the enemies that came with it and after a while, they came to the exact place the knight needed to go. a hole in the wall leading to the soul sanctum. As the two of them entered, the knight stayed on edge. The sanctum probably wasn't like it remembered, and many enemies could have gotten stronger. It needed to be ready to defend both itself and possibly Mono. The knight knew how brutal the sanctum could be, and if Mono got caught in a situation he couldn't handle, he would be as good as gone. The knight led Mono down the dark eerie hallway of the sanctum, determined to get out of this with both of them alive. After they came to the end of the hallway, it wasn't long before their presence was noticed by the twisters. Almost instantly, a soul twister appeared before the two of them, its soul orb orbiting around it, protecting it. The knight grabbed Mono and quickly moved to the side as the soul twister shot out a second orb of soul from its forehead. Once the orb had passed, Mono and the knight leapt at the twister, striking it with their weapons. The twister fell to the ground as a burst of white energy left its mouth. It lied on the ground, now nothing but an empty bag-like corpse. "That was surprising," Mono said, a little tense after the fight. The knight nodded and the two of them pressed forward through the sanctum. As they walked, the knight noticed that the sanctum looked different. It wasn't how it remembered, in fact the sanctum's whole arrangement had changed. The knight had been concerned something like this would happen, and it didn't like it. Now both it and Mono had no idea of where they were going, and that only meant that they were in more danger. Suddenly, two more soul twisters appeared in front of them. The knight made sure to be quick and struck one of the twisters a few times with its nail. But as it was about to strike again, the twister vanished and reappeared behind the knight. The knight dashed through the twister and delivered a final blow to its back. It looked back at Mono and saw that he was having little to no trouble fending off the soul twister. Whenever it shot an orb of soul at him, he would glitch and then unglitch to fight back. Perhaps the knight had been too worried about Mono. After the second soul twister was down, Mono and the knight continued forward. The knight stayed alert, watching out for soul twisters, but something else confronted them. Once they stepped into another room, the door behind them closed shut and a soul warrior appeared above them. The knight dashed away from the warrior's nail and began to counterattack with its own. Mono fought back with his ladle, but the warrior was unfazed. It teleported to the other side of the room and began to shoot orbs of soul at the two. The knight avoided the blasts, but to its surprise, Mono managed to catch one of the orbs in his ladle and send it flying back at the soul warrior. Annoyed, the warrior teleported behind them and leaned down, ready to launch at them. Unfortunately for the warrior, the knight knew that attack too well. It leapt above the warrior and slammed down on top of it with a descending dart. The warrior teleported away and continued to attack the knight and Mono, but they had grown stronger and the soul warrior was no match for them. Within moments, the soul warrior fell to the ground, defeated. The doors opened back up and Mono and the knight continued forward. The knight was feeling more confident about the situation, seeing that Mono was able to hold his own against the soul twisters and the soul warrior. It was clear to the knight that it did not need to worry about Mono no longer and could fully focus on navigating the sanctum. "Man, the Nailsmith did a good job on this ladle," Mono said. "I didn't think I would be able to hit that orb back, but I did. This thing could come in real handy," he said, looking at the shiny silver ladle he now had. "Now, let's get through this place." That was easier said than done. Almost as soon as Mono spoke, a hole opened up underneath them. The two fell deep into the sanctum, with no idea what was waiting for them down at the bottom of this hole. BH1CH24. Simple mistakes. Mono opened his eyes as pain shot through his body. He looked around on the cold floor he had fallen on. He struggled back to his feet and looked around for the knight. He noticed its white horns poking out of a pile of rubble and he ran over to help it. Mono used his ladle to pull the rubble away from the knight and once there was an opening big enough, the knight pulled itself out of the rubble. "Are you alright?" "That was quite a fall," Mono said, looking at his friend. The knight nodded, then began to observe the area they were now in. Mono looked with them and it seemed like they were in a pit of some sort. Mono began to move around and suddenly he heard something that sounded like a gurgle gasp. He looked down at the floor and jumped backwards. A white blob crawled along the floor toward him, waving its limp arms as it moved. Mono quickly smashed the creature with his ladle, then looked around to see if there were any other creatures that would attack. "What was that?" Mono asked, looking at the knight. The knight pulled out its journal and flipped to a page that was titled, Mistakes. After reading through the page, Mono looked back at the knight. "How many of those are we going to run into?" he asked. The knight did nothing but shrug. It was clear to Mono that it didn't know this place that well either. Or it did, and several things had changed since it was last here. Whatever it was, Mono was prepared to run into those things and anything else. He was feeling stronger, braver. He felt like the Mono he used to be before the signal tower and the Thin Man happened. With this new feeling, he and the knight pushed forward, prepared for whatever this place could throw at them. Upon taking a few steps, several other mistakes popped out of the ground and started moving towards them. Mono leapt up and brought his ladle down upon two of the mistakes, crushing them. He noticed another one and quickly swung his ladle, defeating it. He looked at the knight and saw that it had defeated the others. With the path now clear, Mono and the knight moved forward through an open door. As they walked, Mono looked around. This place seemed like some sort of junk pit. There were several stone statues cluttered around the room. Mono and the knight climbed over the statues and made their way into another room. This one looked like an abandoned laboratory of some sort. There were these weird machines everywhere and glass jars filled with a glowing white substance. Suddenly, Mono heard a loud crash from behind him. He looked and saw the knight was breaking open the jars and the substance was flowing into them. That substance then began to surround the knight as it leaned down. Then, the knight walked back up to Mono as if nothing ever happened. Mono shrugged it off. The knight was different than him and it probably needed things that a person like him wouldn't. But then, something appeared in the air and started floating closer to them. The knight leapt at the creature and struck it down with its nail. Once it did, more of those creatures started appearing and Mono prepared himself for battle. Once the things got close, he leapt up at them and batted them down using his ladle. It had become so much easier to use his ladle after the Nailsmith upgraded it. It had become much easier to carry around and it was way lighter, allowing Mono to jump with it drawn. Once the creatures were all stuck down, he and the knight continued ahead. Mono couldn't help but ponder what those creatures were. They were called mistakes, so did they become like that through failed experiments? Did something go wrong and their bodies changed into those creatures? Or was it something else? Mono put the thoughts aside as a locked door lied in front of them. Mono looked around the room for anything that could be used to open it and then saw a glitched staircase. He remembered his glitched power and glitched himself. He walked up the stairs and noticed a set of statues and symbols on the ground. He figured that this must have been some kind of puzzle and tried to figure it out. But as much as he tried, he couldn't figure it out. He had never seen these statues before or any of the symbols. Suddenly, he got an idea. Maybe the knight knows. He thought. He leaned out the opening and held out his hand for the knight. The knight leapt up using a pair of glowing white wings and Mono pulled them into the room. "Can you help me with this?" Mono asked and he pointed at the puzzle. The knight began looking around and then started pushing statues to different symbols. There were many heavy ones and Mono helped the knight move them. It clearly had seen these statues before and knew what the symbols meant. Once all statues were matched with their correct symbols, a small click came from downstairs. The knight hopped down and Mono glitched himself to walk down the staircase. He unglitched once he arrived at the bottom and he saw that the door was now opened. Mono and the knight walked through and were met with a whole arena of mistakes and whatever the flying creatures were called. Great, I can never stop fighting. Mono thought. The creatures advanced towards the two of them and they leapt into action. The knight landed down a descending dark and Mono struck the creatures down from the sky. Once he landed, he glitched himself to avoid the horde of mistakes crawling towards him and the knight obliterated them with a blast of black energy. Mono unglitched and the two fought together to wipe out the remaining threats. Soon, every creature was defeated and the path was cleared. Mono took a few deep breaths. I'm not used to fighting this much. He thought. But then he looked over at the knight. He saw it beckoning for him to follow, for them both to continue pushing on. Even though Mono wasn't used to all this fighting, he had a reason to keep pushing on. To fight for his friends. To fight with his friends. He stood up straight and followed the knight through the mysterious door, ready for whatever came next. PH1CH25. The Master. As the knight walked through the sanctum, they noticed something strange. There was nothing. Nothing but absolute silence. There used to be huge barrages of enemies a few seconds ago, but now there was nothing. And if the knight knew anything from this journey so far, it was that something big was coming. And given the location, it had an idea of what it was going to be. The knight continued advancing, with Mono by its side. They both walked past piles of statues and broken jars and finally came to a ladder. They both climbed up and arrived in a small room leading to the outside. The knight observed the room and saw 3 jars of soul. It broke them open and took the time to heal itself up. It was fully aware of what was going to happen once it and Mono stepped outside. The knight took Mono's hand and the two of them walked outside into the pouring rain. The door behind them shut and the knight waited. "What is that?" Mono asked. "What is that?" The knight looked and saw exactly what it was expecting to see. The Soul Master, rising in the distance. It warped in front of them and let out a soul-piercing scream. The knight drew its nail and Mono drew his ladle. The Soul Master warped closer to the ground, charging at them, and battle broke out. The knight dashed through the master and Mono glitched, avoiding him. The knight followed up with a shade soul right to the back of the master. Enraged, the Soul Master warped above them and started firing several soul orbs at the two of them. Mono and the knight avoided the best they could and the knight let out an abyss shriek. The soul master, getting very irritated, brought up a shield of what looked like some static soul. The knight tried to break the shield, but its nail bounced off like it had hit a metal bar. Mono tried hitting the shield as well, but his ladle had the same effect. The soul master started firing more soul orbs at the two and they both frantically moved around, avoiding the shots. Suddenly, an orb hit the knight, striking it down. It tried to get back to its feet, but another orb was coming and there was no time to react. Luckily, before the orb could hit the knight, Mono stepped in and hit the orb with his ladle. To the knight's surprise, the orb bounced back and hit the soul master's shield. Not only that, but it damaged it. Mono looked at the knight and the two instantly got the same plan. The soul master proceeded to fire more soul orbs and the two hit them back with their weapons, breaking the shield. And with a few blows, the shield collapsed, leaving the soul master unprotected. The duo did not miss their chance to strike. They ran in, hitting the soul master, blow after blow. Suddenly, the soul master grew limp and started warping everywhere, screaming violently. It kept warping, faster and faster, until it burst out into flakes of soul. "I guess we're done with that, right?" Mono asked. The knight shook its head. It knew the fight wasn't over. Suddenly, the soul master appeared above them and slammed into the ground, breaking it. Mono and the knight fell onto another floor made of statues and the soul master continued to attack. The knight quickly got to its feet, avoiding the dives of the master, and Mono glitched himself once again. Suddenly, the soul master stopped and sent a barrage of soul orbs at the two of them. The knight instantly leapt forward, hitting the master with everything it had. It let out every abyss shriek it could, and when it ran out of soul, it kept striking with its nail, not caring how much it got hit. Once the final blow was delivered, the soul master screamed as orange infection burst out from its body and fell to the ground, defeated. Injured, the knight walked over to Mono and offered its hand to help him up. "Are you okay?" he asked. "You got hit with those things quite a lot." The knight nodded and then continued down the sanctum. With the soul master gone, things went very easily for the both of them as there were hardly any enemies left to fight. They climbed down piles of statues and finally came to the room the knight wanted to get to. A long hallway leading to the Watcher's Spire. There, it could defeat Lurian and go to the Temple of the Black Egg, which seemed to be close by, considering there were chains near the signal tower Mono had mentioned. The knight led Mono across and they entered the spire. But right away, the knight could tell something wasn't right. Where was everyone? There were normally hostile bugs everywhere here, so why was the place empty? Also, why were there so many broken TVs? The knight continued guiding Mono through the spire, further wondering why no one was here. Suddenly, it got an answer. There was a light stretching through a slightly open door. The knight looked and almost froze in shock at what it saw. Several bugs were watching a TV and all of their faces were melted. What was going on? "Brat. Even these guys are affected," Mono said. The knight looked at Mono, confused. "Those, my friend, are what I call viewers," Mono said. VH1CH26. Viewers and watchers. The knight stood still, confused about what Mono had said. Catching on, Mono took a deep breath and began to explain. Basically, the signal tower broadcasts a transmission to the TVs that is so addicting that everyone who lives in the city becomes dependent on the signal for them to live their daily lives, he explained. "And that's true, I've seen some people die just to try and watch a TV." The knight understood so far, but there was one thing it didn't understand. It pointed to the melting faces of the bugs in the room. "Well, this is just a guess, but I think the signal tower feeds off of the viewers, consuming their flesh to add on to this big pile of never mind," Mono said. The knight could tell he was feeling uncomfortable, so it stopped asking questions. It understood everything it wanted to anyway. In fact, these TVs might be beneficial because they were drawing the attention of all the enemies. But it had a feeling the spire still wouldn't be a walk in the park. The knight continued forward with Mono and soon they came to their first obstacle. As they got further into the spire, they came to an open room with an exposed TV surrounded by viewer bugs. The two of them tried to sneak past, but suddenly, the TV shorted out. The mind-dead bugs panicked and once they saw the two of them, they immediately assumed they were behind the TV shorting out. They charged and attacked in ways the knight had never seen. The sentries started rapidly swinging their nails without a pattern and the great husk sentry in the group left its shield behind. The knight quickly defeated the husk viewers with the help of Mono and began to realize how tempting the TVs must have been. When the husks were about to die, they would run back to the TV in hopes to see its colors and pictures once more before they died. The great husk sentry even smashed his head into it out of desperation. Once they were all gone, the two of them continued forward. It wasn't long before they came to another block in the road. Their path was blocked by a human viewer, standing in the way of the door. The knight drew its nail and was ready to attack, but Mono grabbed its arm and pulled it back. "No, the human viewers have life-draining powers," he whispered. "If we want to get past them, he have to find a way to get them away from the TV." The knight agreed. The two looked around the room in search of a possible distraction. Soon, the knight found its way to a TV that was turned off. It pointed it out to Mono, and he held up a remote he found on the ground. Hiding behind a chair, Mono turned the second TV on and switched the first one off. The viewer turned over to the second TV and wobbled towards it. With their path cleared, the two of them continued through the spire. They came to an elevator guarded by an electric gate. They looked around for a solution and found a switch for the gate in front of a room. The knight was about to pull the switch down, but a call from Mono stopped it. Mono pointed inside the room and the knight saw the problem. The switch was not only wired to the elevator, but to a TV inside the room, with several viewers watching it. "Once you pull that lever, they're gonna come after us, so run as fast as you can to the elevator," Mono whispered to the knight. The knight nodded and pulled the lever. The electric gate was switched off and the knight leapt down and started dashing over to the elevator. It heard the door fly open behind them and a bundle of shrieks that followed. It continued to dash as it heard several footsteps behind it. Mono slipped through the gate into the elevator and the knight dashed through. It turned around to see the group of faceless bodies pressing against the gate with their hands reaching out for them. But unfortunately for them, the gate powered back on, shocking them all to death. The knight turned back to the elevator and hit the switch, making them go up. Once they reached the top floor, they were met by a bunch of active TVs with viewers and viewer husks watching them. Looking for a way around, the knight noticed Mono climbing up a ladder to a long board above the viewers. It followed him up and the two tiptoed their way across, careful not to disturb the viewers. But as they walked, a stone at the end of the board inched slowly off towards the power switch. Mono and the knight noticed this too late. The stone fell, hitting the switch, turning all the TVs off. All the viewers were enraged and all looked up to the ceiling at the two of them. "Run!" Mono yelled and the two of them sprinted as fast as they could to the other side of the board. The viewers reached up and clawed at the board, trying to grab both of them as they ran. Once they got to the end, the knight broke open a window with its nail and both of them scurried out into the rain. Careful not to fall, they made their way to a large broken window with an elevator at the bottom. They climbed into the room and the knight struck the lever, sending them upwards. They were now arriving closer to Lurien. And that meant they were getting closer to the Watcher Knights. As Lurien's personal guards, they were brutal and attacked as a team. The knight worried as they arrived at the top. They got out of the elevator and the knight was ready to face the knights, but surprisingly, they were gone. Only their empty shells remained. "Looks like whoever was her was claimed by the tower," Mono said. The knight realized what Mono meant and they started walking towards the next elevator. Once inside, the knight struck the lever and as they moved up, they felt the tower begin to bend. Gravity also started warping, keeping them on the ground. Once they arrived at the top of the spire, the knight looked around. The tip of the spire was bent towards the signal tower and the telescope was angled at a TV in the distance. But it wasn't here to look around, it was here for Lurien. It walked over to Lurien's bed and struck him with a dream nail. The knight woke up in the dream realm and saw the Watcher standing before it. Lurien nodded, accepting the knight's reasoning for coming, and the knight began to slash and slash and slash. Once Lurien was defeated, it began to focus and absorb the life of Lurien. At the temple, the final mask disappeared and a loud, radiant roar rang out, reaching all throughout the city. BH1CH27. The Thin Man. Mono waited for the knight to wake up from its sleep as it dealt with the sleeping figure on the bed. He didn't understand the purpose of the knight doing this, but he didn't mind. It seemed to be helping them with their journey. Soon, the figure faded and out of nowhere, a loud roar came from the bottom of the signal tower. Not much later, the knight woke up and looked at Mono. "I guess we're following that roar?" he asked. The knight nodded and once it got to its feet, the two set off yet again. After taking the elevator down, they looked for another way out of the spire. They both didn't want to go through the viewers again, so they searched the rooms for a possible exit. Most of the rooms were just filled with junk, but there was one room that got Mono's attention. The room was faintly lit with a white light and the door was creaked open. Mono walked inside and found an active TV. As the static buzzed, he felt an enormous pain in his head. "Must stop the transmission," he managed to say as he walked towards the TV. He held his hand up to the screen and began halting the transmission. Breathing heavily, Mono tried his best to concentrate on the pattern the static of the TV was making. He kept concentrating and then suddenly, he was brought inside. Inside the last place he wanted to be. The hallway that he had always seen, the hallway he had always feared, the hallway he had always returned to. Mono started desperately looking for a way out of this place, but he heard something. He turned towards the door, looking where the noise was coming from. A music box. 6. Mono thought as he walked closer to the door. Could she still be here? Had she gotten herself trapped again? Mono didn't know, but if there was a chance to find 6, he had to take it. He walked closer and closer to the door until finally he jumped up to the doorknob, pulling it down. The door creaked open and Mono took a small peek inside. There was a music box and there was none other than 6 turning the handle. 6. Mono yelled. He started running towards her, overjoyed. He had wanted to find her all this time and now here she was, right in front of him. But once he got close, the music box disappeared along with 6 into a static dust. Mono was frozen. Was he tricked? What was going on? I thought I would have learned by now not to trust her, an old, scratchy, static-like voice said from the darkness. Mono looked up and froze in absolute fear. In front of him was his greatest nightmare. The Thin Man. Mono slowly started to back away towards the door. He needed to escape. He wanted to run, but his body wouldn't allow him. As he backed up closer to the door, the Thin Man rose up from his chair and stared down at the poor helpless child. Mono closed his eyes. 6 wasn't here to pull him out this time. There was no escape. He waited for his inevitable death. Suddenly, he felt something pull him from behind, yanking him out of the TV. He looked and saw the knight laying on the ground from the recoil. Did you figure out how to get me out of there? Mono asked. The knight nodded and began to stand back up. Mono got to his feet and suddenly, the sound of approaching footsteps reached his ears. He looked back. Back at the TV. Back at the Thin Man, walking towards them and placing his hands on the screen. Run, Mono said. Run. He grabbed the knight's hand and pulled it along with him as he ran out of the room. He heard the sound of the Thin Man escape the TV and stand straight up. They needed to find a place to hide, fast. Mono scurried into one of the rooms and looked around for places to hide. There was under a desk and in the drawers of some shelves. Neither one would be big enough for both of them. Quick, hide in the drawers, I'll hide under the desk, Mono said to his friend. The knight nodded and hopped into one of the drawers and pulled the door shut. Mono dived under the desk and looked up as the Thin Man entered the room. He stood still, looking for the two of them. Suddenly, the room began to shake as if the building was tilting back and forth. The drawers fell open, revealing the knight to the Thin Man. I thought you learned not to trust anyone, he said, and he reached out his hand for the knight. No. Mono yelled. He was not going to let the same thing happen again. He was not going to be helpless as his friend was taken by the Thin Man. He leapt out of his hiding place and grabbed the hand of the knight, trying to pull him away from the Thin Man's telekinetic powers. It's futile to resist me, the Thin Man said. This one will betray you, just like she did. Mono kept pulling, as hard as he could. Suddenly, the knight started hitting his hands, making him let go. What are you doing? Mono yelled at the knight. Mono's grasp couldn't hold and the knight was pulled into the hand of the Thin Man. But to his surprise, the knight unleashed an abyss shriek, crippling the Thin Man. He screamed in pain and let go of the knight. Without wasting any time, Mono knew how to escape. He grabbed the knight's hand and ran back into the room with the TV. Hang on tight, okay? He said to the knight. The knight nodded and clutched the back of his coat. Mono placed his hands on the TV and focused his energy into it. Suddenly, he and the knight were drawn into the television, away from the Thin Man. They bounced around on a fleshy substance and fell through another TV, breaking it. Mono quickly looked back at the knight. Are you okay? He asked. The knight nodded and Mono took a deep sigh of relief. Good, now come on, we need to get going. Nowhere is safe as long as the Thin Man's free, he said. Now where do we need to go? The knight pointed to the signal tower and Mono gulped. If he wanted to protect his friend and get out of this mess alive, he would have to relive the nightmare again. He would have to enter the signal tower. PH1CH28. Signal control. As the two walked through the city, Mono couldn't help but ponder about the Thin Man's words. Would the knight betray him? Had it been using him all this time? Mono didn't know what to think anymore. He needed to ask the knight himself. He needed to know if they were truly friends. The knight spotted a bench and lead Mono over. Mono didn't mind. He needed to sit down and rest for a while after the encounter with the Thin Man. As he sat down, he looked over at the knight. Hey, can I ask you something? He said, looking over. The knight nodded. If we ended up in a situation where you had a choice to either save me or yourself, what would you choose? Mono asked. The knight shook its head. What do you mean? Mono asked, feeling confused. The knight pointed to both of them. Oh, you'd find a way to save us both. The knight nodded. Mono gave out a chuckle. Still, if you couldn't save both of us, what would you choose? Mono asked the knight. Without hesitation, the knight pointed to Mono. Really? Mono asked. The knight continued to nod. Thanks, Mono said. The knight tilted its head and Mono understood what it was asking. No, reason. The thin man's words got to me a little bit. The knight leaned back on the bench and soon they both got up and continued towards the signal tower. Suddenly, as they were walking, Mono heard the sound of static approaching them. Knowing exactly what it was, Mono grabbed his friend and pulled it into a nearby building. Once inside, they both peered out the window, looking for the thin man. "Come out, boy, don't make me come find you," the thin man said. Mono ducked under the window and signaled for the knight to follow him. It did so, and the two of them ran through the building. Suddenly, Mono heard the sound of footsteps walking towards them. The thin man was inside. Mono and the knight quickly hid behind two chests and watched as the thin man walked by. Once he was gone, they both continued to run through the building, looking for a way out. After a long time of searching, they came to a dead end at the end of a long hallway. Mono looked behind him and almost screamed. "Found you," the thin man said. Thinking fast, Mono pulled out his ladle and began to hit some weak boards in the wall. The knight caught on and struck the boards with its nail. The boards broke apart and the two started to run into the hole in the wall. As they did, Mono felt time slow down, causing him to panic. They ran into another room and looked for a possible escape. There was nothing but a broken elevator in a shaft. As the thin man warped behind them, Mono and the knight ran to the elevator and began to jump. The chain holding the elevator broke and they fell down to the bottom floor. They crashed down and fell out of the elevator, landing on the hard rocky floor. Mono stood up and felt a searing pain in his hip. The knight ran over, checking to see if he was okay. "I'm fine," he grunted. "Just hurt my hip." The knight helped Mono walk out of the room and into the outside. Once out, Mono stared at the signal tower, looming above them. Suddenly, the thin man appeared in front of them. "Get behind me," Mono said to the knight. The knight backed up behind Mono and the thin man walked towards them. "You are a fool for trusting them," the thin man said. "They will betray you, just like everyone else." "This one's different," Mono said. "Old people are the same," the thin man replied. "You don't know people like I do." "Must I remind you, boy, that I am you?" the thin man said. Suddenly, Mono felt a sharp pain in his head. He winced in pain as the thin man walked closer. "Do you think that the knight cares about you?" he asked. "They are hollow. They don't have any thoughts, any desires, any feelings. They don't think of you as their friend, they don't think of you as anything. Once the signal tower is brought down, it will betray you, like she did." "Stop," Mono whined, in pain. "Let me remind you how our story ends," the thin man said, reaching his hand out to Mono. Suddenly, Mono saw everything. Six betraying him, falling into the signal tower, sitting on that chair, growing into the thin man. "No, no, stop." Mono cried out. "Accept it, boy," the thin man said. "You are destined to be betrayed. You are destined to become trapped. You are destined to always be alone." "Stop." Mono yelled. He didn't want to hear any more. It was painful and scarring, reminding him of all his failures. "You are destined," the thin man began. "To become me, your worst nightmare." "Wrong," Mono said. He struggled to stand up straight and removed his paper bag. He set it down on the ground and the water from the pouring rain carried it away. Mono looked at the thin man right in the eyes. "I am not afraid of you," he said and began to raise his left hand. "If you won't listen to my words, I'll make you listen," the thin man said, reaching out with his right hand. The two clashed, using their powers against each other. Mono was tired. Tired of being helpless. Tired of being stuck in the same cycle every time. Tired of being alone. He was going to make a change. He focused all of his anger, rage, and hatred at the thin man. "I am not afraid of you," he yelled, and he forced the thin man to bend, falling to the ground as the building swayed back and forth and a black liquid coming up from the ground. "Arrogant, useless boy," the thin man said, standing back up. The two clashed again, focusing even more of their power. "I am not afraid of you," Mono yelled, making the thin man bend to the ground, the buildings continuing to sway and more liquid rising up. "Why, you foolish, stupid, worthless child," the thin man yelled, standing back up. They clashed again, this time, using all of their power. "I am not afraid of you," Mono yelled, sending the thin man bending backwards, falling to the ground, the building swaying even further and even more liquid rising. "Do not think you can win this, boy," the thin man said. "I have grown stronger and I will not fail this time." The thin man reached out his hand again, but suddenly, a black tendril came up from the ground, grabbing it. "What?" he asked in confusion. "What's going on?" he yelled as another tendril grabbed his back. Mono looked behind him and saw the knight, its right arm raised, with black particles swarming around them. It was controlling the tendrils. The thin man panicked as more tendrils grabbed onto him and a black puddle formed underneath him. "No. No," he yelled as the tendrils pulled him into the puddle. The knight pulled its arm down, and the thin man disappeared into the void. Mono looked over at the knight, and together, they raised their arms and started combining their powers. The buildings leaned backwards to Mono's will, and the tendrils wrapped around them, pulling them even further back. Then, they used their powers to move the signal tower right to them. Mono took deep breaths as he recovered from the strain of using his power that much. He looked at the signal tower and saw it was blocked by an egg-like seal. The knight stepped forward, and the seal broke apart, revealing the doorway with an orange and magenta-colored light. Mono looked down at the knight. There's no turning back now," he said. The knight nodded. The two held hands and walked together into the Tower of the Black Egg. PH1CH29. The Tower of the Black Egg. The knight walked with Mono into the tower. They walked through orange and magenta light for a while, but as they progressed, the light turned white. They continued walking, and they arrived inside the tower. The knight looked around. This place looked familiar. It felt familiar. The white glow, the white matter of the floors and walls, and especially the dreamcatcher particles. It was a recreation of the White Palace. "This place looks a lot more different than the last time I was here," Mono said, gazing around. The knight proceeded to move along with Mono, and it found itself reliving the experience of the White Palace again. The first room they entered was filled with vines, covered in thorns. The knight looked around for a while and developed a plan of action. It leapt onto the nearby platforms and swerved around the vines. Mono followed the knight through the vines, and the two came to a wall. Using the mantis claw, the knight helped Mono climb the wall and onto the next platform. However, there weren't any more platforms along the area. The knight looked around for a bit and spotted a lever on the other side of the room. It pointed it out to Mono, and with that, Mono glitched himself. He walked across the thorns and pulled himself up to the lever. He pulled it, and a path of distant platforms opened up for the knight. The knight hopped along the path and met up with Mono at the end. They continued walking and came to a dead end. At least that's what it seemed like. Once they stepped on a stone, doors around them closed, and the stone accelerated up to the next floor. Ahead of them were three bugs dressed up in white attire. Mono pulled out his ladle, ready to fight, but the knight stopped him. Mono tucked his ladle away, and the knight walked right up to the bugs. Once he got close, the bugs instantly stopped talking and bowed to the knight. Mono walked past as well, and the two friends faced their next challenge. A swarm of wingsmold hovered around a series of platforms, leading to the next elevator. The knight walked along, up to a wingsmold, blocking the path. The knight leapt up, struck the wingsmold with its nail, and landed on the next platform. The wingsmold reformed, and the knight signaled for Mono to come over. Mono looked at the wingsmold for a while, then gathering his courage, he leapt up, struck the wingsmold with his ladle, and the recoil sent him to the next platform. After that, Mono didn't have any more trouble crossing over the wingsmold. At the end of the path, a tall figure holding a large weapon stood in front of them in the elevator. A kingsmold. The knight drew its nail and approached the kingsmold. Once it got close, the bug stomped its weapon on the ground and threw it at the knight. The knight jumped over the spinning weapon, and Mono ducked. The weapon circled right back to the kingsmold like a boomerang, and it charged. Working together, Mono and the knight took down the kingsmold and stepped onto the elevator. They zoomed up to the next floor, and the knight heard the familiar sound of spinning saw blades. The next floor was filled with spinning saws and spikes moving up and down. The knight stepped into the room and began making its way across the room. It jumped around the saws, waited for the spikes to go off, then jumped across, waiting for the saws to move across the room, and then it ran all the way to the other end of the room. It looked back and saw Mono move around the saws, then onto the platforms with spikes, but as he jumped across, he tripped and fell down. He managed to grab the ledge of a spike-less platform, but he couldn't pull himself up. The knight jumped back onto the platforms, dashed through the moving saws, and made it to the ledge just in time. It grabbed Mono's hand and pulled him up to the platform. They made their way to the end of the room again, this time, together. The knight helped Mono scale a large wall, and once at the top, they faced a barrage of moving saws and spikes. Mono glitched himself to run through it with ease, but the knight had to carefully time its dashes and jumps to get across the room. It dashed through the first wave of saws, leapt under the platforms covered in thorns, used the monarch wings to jump over the spikes, and finally, it swerved around the saws every corner to reach the other side to meet Mono. Together again, they took the elevator up to the next floor, where nothing but a black empty hallway awaited them. As the two friends walked through the hallway, glowing pillars of light appeared around them, and the floor glowed as they walked on it. They continued walking to the end of the hallway, where a bench was waiting for them. The knight looked at Mono, and they both had the same idea. They sat down on the bench and rested up. "I guess this is it, huh?" Mono said. "Once we continue, we'll bring down the tower, and this adventure will be over." The knight nodded. "It was pretty scary, but also kinda fun," Mono said, leaning back on the bench. The knight remembered the adventure the two of them had. Finding each other in Deepnest, rescuing Mono from the hostile bugs, fighting the hunter, making Rancid Stew, the Tower of Love, the hospital and the doctor, the Nailsmith and Soul Sanctum, and especially the fight with the Thin Man. It all lead up to this. They would face the Hollow Knight and the Knight would contain the infection, becoming the new vessel. Suddenly, the Knight realized something. If it was going to take the Hollow Knight's place, then it wouldn't be able to see Mono again. The seal of binding would activate, immobilizing it, and it would never be able to see Mono again. No more adventures with him, no more conversing with him, no more time with its greatest friend. Did it really want to make that sacrifice? Well, I'm ready to go, Mono said, standing up. Ready to end this tower once and for all? He asked the Knight. The Knight nodded. It did want to make the sacrifice. After all, it confirmed this itself. If it had to choose between saving Mono's life, on its own, it would choose Mono. It would be worth the sacrifice to save the life of its friend. The Knight got off the bench and it walked along with Mono towards fate. Towards the end of this adventure, ready for what had to be done. The H1CH30. The Hollow Knight. The Knight walked with Mono through a tunnel of orange and magenta light. The tunnel was long and every step they took felt like a step towards capture. The signal tower that had merged with the Temple of the Black Egg seemed to have some sort of imprisonment effect the more you stayed inside it. It was fitting in a way. The very thing that the Knight and Mono were walking to was in fact imprisoned. The orange and magenta light came to a stop and the central room of the temple revealed itself. There, bound with 4 sets of chains and protected by a seal of binding, was the last obstacle the two of them needed to face. The Hollow Knight. The Knight walked closer to them and the two knights locked eyed. Both had no mind, both had no will, both had no voice, yet they still understood each other. The Hollow Knight knew what had to be done and so did the Knight. The Knight walked over to the first chain and broke it apart with its nail. Mono noticed and broke the second chain with his ladle. The Hollow Knight watched the two as they broke the chains, its eyes glowing a bright orange. Then, the Knight destroyed the final chain and the Hollow Knight fell from its confines. It looked up at the Knight, then grabbed its nail, leaned back and gave a radiant roar to the two of them. The Hollow Knight bent down and gave 3 long strikes with its nail. The Knight dashed through and Mono glitched himself. Mono ran up to the Hollow Knight and struck it in the head where its shell was cracked. Angered, the Hollow Knight crouched down and thrust itself forward, its nails straight ahead. Mono ducked away from the attack and the Knight gave a few swift strikes to the Hollow Knight's main body. It turned around to face the small Knight and the two clashed their nails together, parrying and striking at each other. The Hollow Knight jumped into the air and slammed down to the ground. It leaned back, ready to give a few more strikes, but Mono was ready. He leapt up to the Hollow Knight and slammed his ladle into its head, expanding the crack further. The Hollow Knight leaned its nail down to parry as Mono readied another strike. Quickly, the Knight dashed over to Mono and pushed him out of the way, taking the Hollow Knight's hit. It swiftly got back to its feet and struck the Hollow Knight several times with its nail. The Hollow Knight roared in anger, enraged at the Knight. It leapt to the other side of the room and something strange happened. From the hole of where its right arm was missing, bubbles of infection swelled up and started shooting at the Knight. It swerved around, avoiding the blasts, and fired a shade soul at the infected Knight. The Hollow Knight leaned down and thrust its nail toward the Knight, but it simply dashed through. Mono ran over and once the Hollow Knight turned around, he bashed them in the head with his ladle. The Hollow Knight jumped into the air and slammed into the ground and small flames came up from the ground. Knowing what was going on, the Knight pulled Mono away as the flames burst up, striking the Knight. "Are you okay?" Mono asked his friend. The Knight nodded, but 3 of its 6 masks were gone. But half health or not, it was not going to stop fighting the Hollow Knight. More infection bubbles swelled up in the Hollow Knight and blasts of orange infection flew at the two of them. Mono glitched and the Knight dashed through and the Hollow Knight thrust itself forward. The blade of its nail struck Mono's arm and the Hollow Knight hit him away. The Knight clashed nails with the Hollow Knight, but it fell to the ground after it was struck by the Hollow Knight's nail. Towering above, the infected Knight raised its nail to finish the job. "No!" Mono yelled. Suddenly, the Hollow Knight stopped. Its nail never swung down. It stared into the hollow eyes of the Knight, standing very still. The Knight stared back and the two vessels locked eyes. Suddenly, bubbles of infection burst from the Hollow Knight's chest. It was then the Hollow Knight's nail came down. But not into the Knight, into itself. The Hollow Knight stabbed itself with its nail, bursting the bubbles of infection. The Knight got back up and suddenly the bubbles grew. The Hollow Knight was lifted off its feet and its body slammed into the ground towards the Knight and Mono. It fell to the ground and more bubbles swelled up and shot at the two friends. Mono and the Knight ran up to the infected Hollow Knight and struck it with their weapons. The bubbles grew and the Hollow Knight was lifted into the air once again. This time, a rain of orange infection burst out from its chest, forcing Mono and the knight to swerve around, attempting to dodge the blasts. The Hollow Knight fell to the ground again and leaned back, ready to deliver another 3 strikes to the two of them. But it only gave one and fell to the ground. The infection swelled inside of it again, and the Hollow Knight raised its nail to stab itself again. The knight realized that this fight wasn't between them and the Hollow Knight, but it was between the Hollow Knight and the infection. It always had been. The knight ran up to the Hollow Knight and started striking it several times. The infection swelled up, lifting the Hollow Knight's body into the air and started slamming it down with brute force. The knight managed to avoid the slams, but the Hollow Knight slammed into the ground on top of it once it was off guard. Mono ran up to the Hollow Knight and slammed his ladle one final time into the cracked shell of the Hollow Knight. The Hollow Knight screamed out and infection began to spew out from its body. The knight struggled up to its feet with only 1 mask of health left. The Hollow Knight was weakened. The infection was exposed. The knight knew what had to be done next. "It's over," Mono said, panting. "We need to get out of this place, it's gonna collapse." The knight slowly walked towards the Hollow Knight. "What are you doing?" Mono asked, stopping his friend. "It's over, we can leave, right?" he said, looking at the knight. The knight shook its head. This needed to be done. It wished it could find a way to say it, a way it could tell its friend its inevitable fate, but it couldn't. It looked back at the Hollow Knight and continued walking towards it. The Hollow Knight saw the knight approaching and struggled to hold its nail towards the knight. The knight understood why. The Hollow Knight desperately wanted to be the one to contain the infection. More than anything, that's what it wanted to do. But it couldn't. The infection was breaking through. The knight had to take its place. As much as it didn't want to, there was no other choice. The knight hesitated to step forward and face its destiny as the next Hollow Knight. Then suddenly, a glimmer. A small glimmer. A glimmer of hope. From the hole in the Hollow Knight's cracked shell, a single dream catcher particle flew out. The knight eyed the particle as it faded into the air. Was it possible? Was there another way? One dream catcher particle turned into 2, then 3, then 4, and suddenly the Hollow Knight's shell burst open and several dream catcher particles flew out into the room. The knight saw it. Another way to end this. A way to end the infection for good. A way to avoid its fate, a way to stay with Mono. The knight stepped forward, this time without hesitation. It drew the dream nail and stabbed it into the Hollow Knight's shell, widening the rift between reality and the dream realm. The large burst of dream catcher particles exploded out from the dream nail and the knight fell into the dream realm, determined more than ever to put an end to the infection once and for all and to stay with its best friend Mono. VH1CH31. The Radiant Signal Tower. The knight woke up from the fall into the dream realm. It stood up and looked around. It looked like it was in any ordinary part of the dream realm, but something stood out. A light. A large blazing, radiant light loomed over the area. The knight saw a few platforms in the area with them and it began to climb them. It got to the top platform and drew its nail, facing the light. Wings emerged from the light and the sky of the dream realm began to shake. The wings spread out as the light increased. Suddenly, in a brilliant flash of light, the entity appeared before the knight, revealing her true form and giving out a radiant roar. The Radiance had finally shown herself. "Ancient enemy." The Radiance roared. "So you've come to defeat me? To erase my existence so that I may be forgotten?" she bellowed. The knight swiped its nail across the air and got into attack position. "Very well," the Radiance cried. "Have at you." The platforms above the main piece of land disappeared and the knight fell to the floor. It got itself back up and the Radiance appeared before it. The knight leapt up, striking the Radiance with its nail. She warped away and summoned sharp spikes to come from the right. The knight leapt through an opening in the wall of spikes and continued to strike her. The Radiance teleported to the other end of the battlefield where she sent more spikes from her main body at the knight. The knight avoided the spikes and the Radiance summoned small sun orbs and sent them spiraling towards the knight. The knight did its best to avoid the suns, making them crash into the floor beneath it, but it managed to get hit by one of them. It couldn't afford to take hits. Its health was restored, but now it only had 4 masks left. The knight leapt up to the Radiance and let out an abyss shriek, severely damaging her. "Azathoth! I call upon your aid," the Radiance yelled. Suddenly, the knight found it was unable to move. It was held by some strange force and couldn't even move its arm. It needed to figure out what was causing this, but it was completely immobilized. The knight stood there as the Radiance powered up a large blast of light. "Mono Pav." Mono looked at his friend as it lied down on the floor with the Hollow Knight. He shook them, trying to get them awake. What was it doing? Mono tried to get them up, but suddenly, the room began to shake. Mono looked and saw the walls around him were crumbling and revealing an entity all too familiar. The flesh entity Azathoth. One of the creature's several eyes looked at the knight and an orange beam shot from it, hitting the knight. "No. Mono yelled. He was not going to let his friend die. They had come so close, they couldn't afford to fail now. He ran towards the eye, his ladle in his hands. He climbed up to the eye and started batting it with his ladle. He slammed it onto the eye 3 times until the eye went gray and the beam faded away. But his problems didn't stop there. 2 more eyes came out and shot their own beams at the knight. Mono ran over to the closest eye and started violently swinging his ladle into it. "Leave my friend alone," he yelled. The second eye went gray and Mono ran over to the last one. He beat the eye with his ladle and once it went black, the walls began crumbling even further, revealing the flesh from behind. Suddenly, the floor under the knight was picked up and pushed into the air by a tower of flesh. "Hey! Give them back!" Mono yelled and he began chasing after the knight. "Knight Pav!" The knight braced itself for the attack, but suddenly, its movement returned. It scrambled out of the way of the Radiance's blast and began striking her once more. "I will not be forgotten," the Radiance bellowed. "I will rule all of Hellenist and more." She gave another roar and spikes came up from the ground, making the knight's movement limited. The Radiance's face lit up and beams of light erupted from her, scattering in all directions. The knight managed to avoid the beams and keep fighting. The knight noticed the area it was standing on lit up suddenly. The spikes from the other side faded and the knight dashed over as the side it stood on filled up with spikes. The knight was left no time to rest as a wall of light made its way towards the knight. It dashed through and started striking the Radiance. As it fought, the clouds beneath them darkened, filling up with void. The knight needed to weaken the Radiance enough to drag her into the void. There, the siblings and the void itself would end her for good. Suddenly, the knight became immobilized again and the Radiance charged up another laser blast. With no way to escape, the knight prayed that whatever force saved it last time would save it again. "Mono Pav." Mono climbed the signal tower, chasing after his friend. The eyes noticed and shot bubbles of infection at him. Mono glitched and continued climbing up to the knight. He came across an eye, shooting a beam of light at his friend and started to attack them with his ladle. Once they were destroyed, he kept climbing, determined to save the knight. He leapt opened a door and found himself in a black room covered in spider silk. The signal tower was messing with his head. He struck the silk with his ladle and brought himself back to reality. He spotted the next 2 eyes, shooting their beams at the knight and climbed up to them. He glitched to avoid the blasts from the other eyes and beat the 2 harming his friend with his ladle. He finished off the both of them and suddenly, he was in a pitch black cave. More tricks of the signal tower. He turned on his light and ran through the cave. He came to a door covered in spider webbing and he broke it apart with his ladle. He came through a door and continued to climb the signal tower as more and more of it began to crumble. There was nothing going to stop him from saving the knight. He lost one friend already, he was not going to lose another. "Knight Pav." The knight's prayers were answered and its movement was returned. Before the Radiance could fire her blast, it struck her with an abyss shriek. The Radiance fell to the ground, the light draining from her body. This was the perfect opportunity to strike. The knight commanded the void to wrap around her and drag her in. The void tendrils obeyed, but before they could drag her down, the Radiance vanished into a cluster of essence and flew up to the sky. More platforms appeared and the knight followed her up to the sky above. The Radiance appeared before the knight, enraged at its actions. "Fall. Break," she yelled. "I will make you suffer. I will not be forgotten." She summoned several spikes from the sides and the knight swerved through. Another wall of light made its way towards the knight, but it managed to dash through. It hopped across platforms, meeting the Radiance and delivering multiple blows to her main body. The Radiance warped away and commanded more sun orbs to attack the knight. The knight swerved through the suns, but one of them managed to hit it. With only 2 masks of health left, the knight used some of its ult to focus and restore a mask of health. It ran over to the Radiance and started rapidly striking her. It was not going to fail. It was not going to give up. It was not going to allow the Radiance to infect the bugs of Hellenist anymore. The Radiance cried out and the knight became immobilized once more. The Radiance charged up another blast, but the knight was confident. Something was looking out for it and it would escape the immobility again. "Mono Pav." Mono ran up the crumbling stairs of the signal tower, avoiding the blasts and falling debris the eyes shot at him. As he neared the top, a strong light touched his skin, greatly burning him. Mono had to glitch himself in order to climb any higher. He sprinted up, the radio static buzzing in his head. Suddenly, he arrived at the top of the signal tower. He looked and saw the main eye of Azathoth staring at him. Mono charged over with his ladle and struck the eye with all his might. The eye roared and Mono was sent to the edge of the signal tower. Catching his balance and managing not to fall over, Mono ran towards the main eye again and struck it with his ladle. The eye roared again and Mono was sent to the edge of the tower again. The static buzzing in his head was getting too loud. He needed to unglitch, but if he did he would burn up from the light that Azathoth was dispersing. Mono struggled to move forward. He clutched his ladle, and his head swelled with pain. Just a little further he thought, as he struggled to reach the eye again. He looked up, and an image of Six appeared in front of him. Suddenly, he was at the foot of the signal tower, and Six was holding onto his hand. She smiled as she let go, letting him fall into the depths of the tower. Mono snapped himself back to reality. He couldn't fail. Not yet. Not now. His head pulsed with pain as he approached the main eye. His whole body coursed with pain all around, ready to give up. He limped over, the pain worsening and worsening. With all of his might, he screamed and slammed his ladle down on the main eye. The eye cried out as the infection dispersed away from it. And with that, the light faded and the main eye of Azathoth went grey. Suddenly, a burst of black energy came from underneath Mono, and a bunch of dark figures flew up to the light above them. Night Pav. The knight's movement returned, and it ran up to the radiance, letting out a series of abyss shrieks, severely damaging her. Realizing the presence of Azathoth had faded, the radiance dispersed into a cluster of essence and flew up as high as she could. More platforms appeared, and the knight began to climb towards her as she shot down beams of blazing hot light energy. As the knight climbed, the void climbed with it. The siblings escaped from the void and rose up to meet the knight as it climbed up to the top to defeat the radiance. The knight arrived at the final platform where the radiance had nowhere left to go. The knight leapt up and struck her one final time. The void surrounded them and the knight was suspended in the air. Void tendrils wrapped around the radiance, holding her still. The shade of the hollow knight rose up from the void and tore the radiance's face open, revealing the light within her. The knight's shell broke, revealing the void within itself, and 6 tendrils grew in place of its arms. Without hesitation, the knight struck the radiance several times with its tendrils, expelling the light from her. It gave one final blow, and the light from the radiance scattered out into the sky. More void tendrils wrapped around her and dragged her down into the depths of the void. She fell deep into the void, her final rays of light blasting out and fading into the void. BH1CH32. The journey continues. Mono took heavy breaths as he recovered from the pain he felt when he was glitched. He didn't know what to do next. He needed to recover first, but how would he find the knight? Suddenly, the light in the sky vanished, leaving the dark gray sky. Before Mono could figure out what was going on, the ground beneath him began to violently shake. The signal tower was collapsing. There was no time to think. He had to get out of this place as fast as possible. He sprinted down the stairs of the crumbling tower as the angry eyes and flesh tried to crush him. It was just like last time. If the signal tower went down, it was going to do everything it could to take Mono down with it. But he didn't have any time to spare. Mono needed to find out where the knight was and get out. That was the plan. He ran inside the crumbling signal tower and frantically looked for his friend. "Hey!" he yelled. "Knight. We need to leave now." A large chunk of rubble fell down right next to him and Mono remembered he needed to leave. He ran as fast as he could down the tower, the flesh close behind, trying to consume him. Mono's path soon became blocked by a large blob of flesh. He leapt onto it, his feet hitting the squishy, icky flesh. Trying not to puke, he continued running down the stairs, doing his best to avoid the rubble and flesh. He wanted to glitch, but due to the extreme pain he felt from last time, glitching just seemed impossible. So he kept running. Down and down he ran, the signal tower crushing all around him. He came to a floor where the stairs ended. He looked around for a possible exit and saw an open hallway. He sprinted through the hallway, his lungs breathing heavy breaths as he ran. The flesh swelled up behind him, surging forward towards him. "Don't stop running, don't stop running, don't stop running," Mono thought as he ran. He kept on running down the hall until he came to a long piece of flooring above a giant gap in the tower. In front of him was exactly what he needed. An exit. As the bridge crumbled, Mono ran as fast as he could towards the exit. A piece of the bridge broke off in front of him. He was going to have to jump for it. He leapt off the edge towards the exit, his hand flailing, trying to grab onto the edge. He landed on the edge and grabbed on tight. He tried to pull himself up, but the ledge he was on was breaking off. He needed the knight to save him. But the knight wasn't here. The ledge broke off and time slowed down as Mono fell into the signal tower. No one was there to save him. No one to grab his hand. No one to stop his fall. Six wasn't there to catch him. The knight wasn't there to catch him. Mono fell. Into the signal tower, into his destiny. Even with a different friend, he still couldn't escape his fate. He was doomed to become the Thin Man. Forever. Suddenly, something caught his arm. He looked and saw 3 black tendrils latched onto his left arm, holding him up. He looked up and a tear escaped his face. A deep black figure with 6 tendrils was grabbing him. And while they looked different, the look from their eyes made it clear who they were. It was the knight. "You came to help me," Mono said, more tears running down his face. The knight nodded and the two stared at each other in the eyes. The sound of falling rubble reminded them of the urgency. The knight pulled Mono up to the ledge and the two ran towards the exit. Mono pressed his hands onto the static door and zoomed through the TV, away from the signal tower. Mono fell to the hard stone ground. He stood up and looked around. He was back in the pale city of tears. The TV he came from shut off and he looked outside. He was at the bottom floor, so he was able to walk outside. The refreshing rain poured all over his face as he saw the signal tower fall to the ground. It was glorious. Suddenly, he remembered something. Where was the knight? They came with him, didn't they? Mono looked around the streets for his friend but found something heartbreaking. The shell of the knight cracked in two. Mono stumbled over to the broken shell of the knight and fell to his knees. No, please tell me it isn't true," he whimpered as he picked up the two halves of the shell. "Please tell me it isn't true," he cried out. "I can't lose another friend." He burst out into tears as he looked down at the knight's broken shell. They were gone. All that work, all that effort to bring down the signal tower, and he lost another friend. He didn't want this. He didn't want to keep doing this. He wanted to end his life. Nothing seemed to be worth living for anymore. Then, a black particle fell of the shell. Followed by another and another and another. Mono looked up and almost burst into tears again. The shade of the night loomed above them. It flew down to the shell and a burst of black energy flew around it. The pieces came together and the crack mended, disappearing completely. A cloak came out from under the shell and a gleaming nail rested upon the back. Its body formed and the knight landed on the ground, restored. Mono fell onto the knight, hugging it. "I thought you were gone," he cried, tears flowing down his face. The knight hugged back, comforting its friend. "You actually caught me," Mono said. "You actually caught me." The two friends stood back up and looked at the pile of rubble that was now the signal tower. "It's over," Mono said. "It's finally over." The knight looked at Mono as if to ask, "What now?" Mono thought and remembered Six. She could still be out there. And with this world becoming more dangerous, she could be in great danger. "We need to find Six," Mono said. "She's my friend and she could be in trouble. That's what we do next." The knight gave a nod of agreement. "But, where do we start?" The two thought and a poster came up to them from the running water on the streets. The knight picked it up and Mono read it aloud. "Come to the mall. Where you are safe and can satisfy your hunger," he read. Suddenly, a loud noise came from above them. It sounded like a large boat had arrived. In the distance, Mono saw a bunch of big, large bugs walking up towards the noise. Mono remembered how much Six loved to eat. If this mall was a place where you could satisfy hunger, an idea came into Mono's head. "We're going to the mall," Mono said. "That's where we can find Six." The knight shrugged and stood next to Mono as if to say, "I'm here with you. I don't know what's going to happen or what we'll find there. But what I do know is that whatever happens, we'll face it together," Mono said. The knight nodded and the two held hands, walking off towards the mall, ready for what came next. The little boy, looking for his missing friend. A paper bag over his face, looking to make amends. The little knight, behind a shell and hollow soul. Nor beast nor bug, with no voice and void control. And together, you two. There is so much you can do. If you're afraid, don't be scared. We'll make little dreams from these hollow nightmares. Let me know in the comments below if you guys want the next part. Also check out my other video that has been shown and left. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and share this video. And have a fantastic day. Bye.